The scent of salt and Nile silt is familiar, but the language spoken by the soldiers in the street is not. It is a harsh guttural Greek, and it echoes off the new limestone of buildings that rise with an unnerving foreign geometry. You are an Egyptian scribe, trained in the ancient traditions of Memphis, now stationed in the burgeoning coastal city of Alexandria. For a generation, the world has been unmade and remade by these Macedonian conquerors. Now, their great leader, Alexander, is dead. Meant for a grandeur in Macedon, was intercepted, stolen, and brought here to Egypt. It lies in a temporary shrine, a political relic of immense power, guarded by the most cunning of his generals, a man named Ptolemy. He claims to be merely the satrap, the governor, ruling in the name of Alexander's enfeebled half-minus brother and infant son. But you see the truth in the cold, calculating eyes of his administrators and in the way he fortifies the borders. He is not a steward. You are witnessing the beginning of a new dynasty, one that will place a Greek pharaoh on the sacred throne of Egypt. You write what you see, using the old hieroglyphs and the new Greek script, chronicling the start of an era. You cannot possibly know that the line you are recording will, over the next 3 centuries, descend into a darkness so profound that it will devour itself, brother by brother, sister by sister. The story of the Ptolemaic Dynasty begins, as so many tragedies of the ancient world do, with the death of a great man. In June of 323 BC, Alexander the Great died in Babylon, leaving behind a conquered empire that stretched from Greece to India, but no designated heir. His generals, the decay or successors, immediately began to circle the corpse of his empire, their loyalty to his memory rapidly dissolving into personal ambition. Among these powerful men was Ptolemy, son of Lagus, a cautious, intelligent, and profoundly pragmatic Macedonian nobleman who had been one of Alexander's closest companions. While others vied for control of the heartlands of Macedon and Persia, Ptolemy made a calculated choice. He selected Egypt. It was a masterstroke of strategic foresight. Egypt was geographically isolated, protected by vast deserts to the east and west, the Mediterranean to the north, and the cataracts of the Nile to the south. This made it far more defensible than the sprawling, open territories claimed by his rivals. More importantly, it was immensely wealthy. The annual, predictable flooding of the Nile made its agricultural output legendary, a grain basket that could feed vast armies and a sprawling bureaucracy. Ptolemy understood that controlling Egypt meant controlling a secure and self-sufficient power base. His first move was one of audacious political theater. He arranged to have Alexander's funeral cortege, which was en route to Macedon, diverted. He hijacked the body of the deified conqueror and brought it to Memphis, the ancient capital of Egypt. This act was more than mere grave-robbing. It was a profound statement of legitimacy. In the ancient world, possession of the ruler's body was a powerful claim to be his true successor. It was the proper burial of their liberator-turned-pharaoh. For the Greeks and Macedonians, it signaled that Ptolemy, not the regents in Babylon, was the true custodian of Alexander's legacy. The body would later be moved to a magnificent tomb in Ptolemy's new capital, Alexandria, becoming a site of pilgrimage for centuries. Initially, Ptolemy ruled with nominal deference to the fractured imperial structure, styling himself as satrap on behalf of Alexander's intellectually disabled half-brother, Philippi and his posthumously born son, Alexander IV. This was a political fiction maintained by all the successors. In reality, Ptolemy moved swiftly to consolidate his personal control. He eliminated Clemens of Nociates, the powerful financial officer left in charge by Alexander, and seized his enormous treasury. He established a new capital, Alexandria, a Greek minor-style port city that would become the intellectual, cultural, and economic center of the Hellenistic world. He expanded his territory, seizing Cyprus, and fended off invasions from his rivals, most notably an attack by Perdiccas in 321 BC and a massive invasion by Antigonus I in 306 BCE. His successful defense of the island of Rhodes against Antigonus's son earned him the epithet Zoter, or Savior. In 305 BCE, after Antigonus had declared himself king, Ptolemy and the other successors followed suit. He was proclaimed Basileus, king, officially transforming his satrap into the Ptolemaic kingdom. His reign as Ptolemy Isoter was a model of Hellenistic state-building. He established a great library and museum of Alexandria, attracting scholars, scientists, and poets from across the Greek-speaking world, which blended aspects of the Egyptian Osiris and Apis with the Greek Zeus, Hades, and Dionysus. This was a deliberate policy designed to create a shared religious identity for his dual population of Egyptian subjects and Greek-Macedonian overlord. His marital and familial policies were equally pragmatic. He engaged in conventional dynastic marriages to secure alliances and produce heirs. He married the Persian noblewoman Artacama at Alexander's behest, and later took to Macedonian wives of high standing. Eurydice, daughter of the powerful regent Antipater, and later, her lady in-waiting, Baroness I. These unions were political, designed to secure his position within the ruthless world of the Diaduchi. He produced numerous children who formed the foundation of the new royal house. His focus was on external threats and internal stability. The dynasty he founded was built upon a bedrock of Macedonian tradition, strategic acumen, and calculated cultural fusion. There was no hint, in the careful and conventional reign of the savior king, of the radical and destructive path his descendants would choose to follow. He had secured the kingdom with his sword and his mind, but he had planted a seed of absolute power in a foreign land, a seed that, once rooted, would grow into something monstrous and self-consuming. The stable foundation laid by Ptolemy Isoter was tested immediately upon his death around 283 BC. In a move that foreshadowed the dynasty's future disregard for primogeniture, the aging founder had chosen his successor not from tradition, but from preference. His eldest son, the volatile and ambitious Ptolemy Karaunos, born to his first Macedonian wife Eurydice, was passed over in favor of a younger son, also named Ptolemy, the child of his favored wife, Baroness I. This decision secured the throne for a more placid and scholarly heir, but it also created a dangerous rival. Ptolemy Karaunos was exiled and found refuge in the court of Lysimachus of Thrace, another of Alexander's aging successors. His simmering resentment would inject a poison into the international politics of the Hellenistic world for years to come. The new king, Ptolemy II, was a different man from his father. Where Isoter had been a soldier-king forged in the crucible of Alexander's campaigns, his son was a ruler of peace and prosperity. He was a patron of the arts and sciences, overseeing the expansion of the library of Alexandria and fostering an era of immense cultural and economic flourishing. His reign would earn him the epithet Philadelphus, meaning sister-loving, a title that would become profoundly and literally true. His first marriage was a conventional one, a strategic alliance with the daughter of Lysimachus, a woman named Arsinoe. This union produced 3 illegitimate children, including the future Ptolemy II, and seemed to set the kingdom on a standard Hellenistic path. This path was irrevocably altered by the arrival of a refugee at the Alexandrian court around 279 BC. The refugee was Arsinoe I, the full-blooded sister of Ptolemy II, and a woman who had already lived a lifetime of brutal political maneuvering. She had been married to the elderly King Lysimachus, wielding considerable influence in his court. After his death in battle, she made a disastrous marriage to her own paternal half-brother, the exiled Ptolemy Karaunos, who murdered her 2 youngest sons from her marriage to Lysimachus before her eyes. She fled to Egypt, seeking sanctuary in her brother's kingdom. But Arsinoe was not a woman content with the quiet safety of exile. She was a Ptolemy, possessed of the same ambition and intelligence as her father. At the court of Alexandria, she quickly became the dominant influence over her younger brother. Within a few years, a charge of conspiracy was leveled against Ptolemy I's wife, Arsinoe. Whether the plot was real or a fabrication orchestrated by Arsinoe, II is lost to history, but the outcome was decisive. Arsinoe was exiled to Coptos in southern Egypt, and her children were effectively disinherited, though they were later adopted by Arsinoe herself. The stage was set for an act that was deeply taboo in the Greek world but had a long and sacred history in the land of the pharaohs. Around 275 BCE, Ptolemy II married his full sister, Arsinoe II. To the Macedonians and Greeks who formed the ruling class of Egypt, this union was shocking. Incest was an abhorrence in their culture. But the marriage was not a product of passion. It was a masterstroke of cold, political calculation. For Ptolemy II, it solved several problems. It created a partnership with a woman of proven political skill whose loyalty was, in theory, indivisible from his own. It eliminated the need for a foreign queen whose family might one day become a political or military threat. Most importantly, it created a bloodline of perfect, undiluted Macedonian minus Ptolemaic purity. Their children would be descended from both of Ptolemy's most favored lines, a dynasty turning in on itself to create something sealed and absolute. For Arsinoe II, the marriage was a return to power on an unprecedented scale. She was not merely a queen consort. She was a current to titles, shared in her brother's royal epithets, and had her own coinage issued, a rare honor for a queen in the Hellenistic world. She was depicted on monuments in the style of an Egyptian pharaoh, wearing the twin crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt. This leads to the most critical justification for the marriage, its appeal to their Egyptian subject. Royal sibling marriage had been practiced by Egyptian pharaohs for centuries. It was associated with the gods, most notably Isis and Osiris, who were both siblings and spouses. By adopting this ancient pharaonic custom, Ptolemy II and Arsinoe II were consciously and deliberately layering of Egyptian legitimacy over their Greek rule. They were no longer just foreign conquerors, they were behaving as true pharaohs, in keeping with the traditions of the land they governed. The union of Ptolemy II and Arsinoe II, born of political necessity and personal ambition, was the dynasty's foundational transgression. It was a pragmatic choice that served the immediate needs of the state, securing the throne and solidifying the family's power. Arsinoe II proved to be a formidable and effective queen, heavily influencing foreign policy and internal administration until 170 BC. Ptolemy II was said to have been genuinely grief-stricken. But the precedent had been set. The door had been opened to a practice that would isolate the Ptolemaic royal house, creating a closed genetic and political system. It established the queen, often the king's sister, as a central and frequently rivalrous power within the court. This first incestuous marriage was a success, but it normalized a behavior that would, over generations, concentrate paranoia, ambition, and instability within the family unit until the family itself became the primary threat to the kingdom's survival. The death of Arsinoe I around 270 BCE left Ptolemy II in a position of unique political and personal solitude. He had lost not just a wife, but a co-ruler of exceptional talent. In response, he initiated a program of memorization that would permanently encode the incestuous union into the religious and political DNA of the dynasty. He did not simply mourn his sister-wife, he elevated her to the status of a goddess. This process, known as apotheosis, was not entirely new in the Hellenistic world. Alexander the Great was worshipped as a god, and Ptolemy I had established a state cult for Alexander, but the specific application here was revolutionary. Ptolemy I deified Arsinoe and then, in an act of unprecedented self-promotion, deified himself alongside her while he was still alive. They were to be worshipped together as the Devour Delphoi, the sibling gods. This was not a minor, local cult. It was a state-sanctioned religion, aggressively promoted throughout Egypt and the Ptolemaic overseas territories. Festivals were established in their honor, and new temples were constructed. In Alexandria, a grand temple known as the Arsinoe Ion was built. Across Egypt, the sibling gods were formally integrated into the ancient temple structures of the native Egyptian pantheon, a policy known as sin-aoi, or gods who share a temple. This meant that within the sacred precincts of Toyin Memphis, or Amun-Ra in Thebes, statues of the Greek king and his sister-wife were placed alongside the ancient, revered Egyptian deities, receiving the same rites and offerings. The creation of the Devour Delphoi cult was a complex ideological maneuver. On one level, it provided the ultimate justification for the sibling marriage that had been so unsettling to Greek sensibilities. The union was no longer a mere political arrangement or a personal preference. It was a reflection of divine order, an earthly reenactment of the sacred marriage between gods like Zeus and Hera from the Greek tradition, or, more potently, the Egyptian sibling deities Osiris and Isis. By transforming themselves into gods, Ptolemy and Arsinoe retroactively sanctioned their own transgression, elevating it beyond the reach of mortal criticism. Their marriage was not a violation of custom, it was the custom of a higher, divine class of beings. On another level, the cult dramatically enhanced the power of the monarchy. A Hellenistic king was an absolute ruler, but a living god was an unassailable one. The ruler cult created a direct, personal link between the subjects and the state, embodied in the divine person of the king. To be loyal to the king was a civic duty, to worship him was a religious one. Disloyalty thus became not just treason but sacrilege. This fusion of religious and political authority was a powerful tool for social control, particularly in a kingdom composed of a small Macedonian, Greek elite ruling over a vast Egyptian populace. The cult provided a common framework for worship, binding the two cultures together in shared reverence for the royal house. The specifics of the cult's implementation reveal its importance. A new priesthood was established, the KPH or OS of Arsinoe Philadelphus, a high-status annual position for a noble maiden in Alexandria who carried a sacred basket in processions. Her name was used alongside the priest of Alexander to date all official documents, both in Greek and Demotic Egyptian script, placing the deified Sister Queen at the very heart of the state's bureaucracy and chronology. Coins were minted depicting the conjoined busts of Ptolemy I and Arsinoe, I on one side, an unmistakable image of a divine ruling pair. Other coins showed Arsinoe alone, veiled and crowned, with a cornucopia, symbolizing her divine power to grant abundance and prosperity to the kingdom. The long-term consequences of this institutionalized deification were profound. It cemented the precedent that Ptolemaic queens, particularly those who were also the king's sister, were not mere consorts but divine beings with a right to power in their own regard. The deification of Arsinoe II provided a blueprint for future ambitious royal women, like the many Cleopatras, to claim not just political influence but sacred authority. The cult of the sibling gods created a conceptual framework that made future sibling marriages not just possible, but logical and even necessary. To maintain the purity of a divine bloodline, intermarriage with mortals became increasingly unthinkable. The dynasty was now officially a race apart, a family of gods living among men. This divine status would foster a growing sense of isolation and exceptionalness within the royal family, a belief in their inherent superiority that would justify any action, no matter how cruel or self-serving. The cult that Ptolemy I created to honor his sister and secure his legacy would become the ideological incubator for the paranoia, megalomania, and violence that would later consume his descendants. The elaborate ideological edifice of the sibling gods provided a powerful sense of divine right, but it could not insulate the dynasty from the vanities of Hellenistic geopolitics. The accession of Ptolemy II, known as Euergetes or the benefactor, proceeded smoothly after his father's death in 246 BCE. He was the legitimate son of Ptolemy II and his first wife, Arsinoe I, but had been formally adopted by his stepmother and aunt, the deified Arsinoe I, thereby preserving the purity of the divine lineage. He inherited a kingdom at the zenith of its power and wealth. However, the first significant act of his reign would demonstrate the fragility of familial bonds when they intersected with the ambitions of rival empires. The first cracks in the Ptolemaic foundation would appear not in Alexandria, but hundreds of miles away in the heart of the rival Seleucid Empire. The conflict was rooted in a dynastic marriage, the primary to love Ptolemaic foreign policy. Ptolemy I's full sister, Baroness B. her Nop Horus, had been married to the Seleucid king Antiochus I the Oes. As part of the marriage agreement, Antiochus had been forced to repudiate his first wife, Laodice I, and to disinherit her sons in favor of any children he might have with Berenice. This arrangement created a volatile and resentful faction within the Seleucid court, centered around the spurned Laodice. Upon the death of Antiochus I, a death widely suspected to have been the result of poisoning by Laodice, the crisis erupted. Laodice moved swiftly to have her own son, Seleucus II, proclaimed king, while Berenice, secluded in Antioch, insisted that her infant son was the rightful heir. Berenice sent urgent appeals to her brother in Egypt, pleading for military intervention. Ptolemy II responded, recognizing that this was not merely a family dispute, but a chance to exert massive influence over his greatest rival. He mobilized the Ptolemaic army and navy and began what would become the Third Syrian War, also known as the Lydian War. His initial campaign was a stunning success. He swept through Seleucid territory, occupying Syria and marching as far as Babylon. The wheels of ancient warfare turned slowly. By the time his forces reached Antioch, it was too late. Berenice and her young son had been cornered in a fortified compound at Daphne, near the capital. Under the pretense of negotiation, agents loyal to Laodice gained access to them, and they were both brutally murdered. The assassination of a Ptolemaic princess and her child, a potential king, was a profound shock. It demonstrated that even the most sacred bonds of marriage and kinship offered no protection in the cutthroat world of Hellenistic succession struggles. For Ptolemy II, it transformed the war from a strategic intervention into a punitive expedition. He captured and, according to some sources, executed Laodice, exacting a personal and political revenge. While the war was ultimately a strategic victory for Egypt, securing new territories and vast amounts of plunder, the murder of Berenice sent a chilling message. It was a stark illustration of the methods, conspiracy, betrayal, and the elimination of rival heirs, including women and children, that were becoming normalized in the dynastic politics of the age. These were tactics that, once learned, could easily be imported into the court of Alexandria itself. While the reign of Ptolemy II is remembered as a period of external strength, historical accounts suggest that the internal political environment of the court was beginning to sour. The historian Polybius, writing a century later but with access to earlier sources, hints at an atmosphere of intrigue that was taking root. The absolute power of the king, amplified by his divine status, created a system where influence was gained not through public debate or merit, but through proximity to the monarch and the skillful manipulation of his trust. This environment naturally bred sycophants, conspirators, and professional courtiers whose survival depended on the downfall of their rivals. Poison became the unspoken arbiter of court disputes. The royal household was a complex machine of food tasters, bodyguards, and physicians, all tasked with protecting the king from an invisible threat that could be lurking in any cup of wine or plate of food. This constant vigilance, however, fostered a pervasive paranoia. Every political disagreement, every rival faction, carried the potential for a quiet and untraceable death. Furthermore, Ptolemy II was not immune to exercising ruthless authority. He is recorded to have quashed a rebellion during his eastern campaign and was certainly capable of ordering executions. While his reign was not characterized by the wanton cruelty of his successors, the mechanisms of absolute power and lethal enforcement were firmly in place. The cracks were not just the dramatic events like his sister's murder, but the subtle, systemic decay of trust within the palace walls. The highly centralized, insulated, and divinely sanctioned power of the Ptolemaic court was beginning to create the perfect conditions for the pathologies that would soon overwhelm it. Despite the brutal opening act of his reign, a war initiated to save his sister, which culminated in avenging her murder. The era of Ptolemy II Euergetes is recorded by ancient historians as the apex of Ptolemaic power and prestige. Returning from his victorious campaign in the Seleucid territories, he brought with him an unimaginable quantity of plunder. More significantly for his public image, he brought back numerous Egyptian cult statues that had been seized centuries earlier by the Persian king Cambyses II. This act of repatriation was a masterful piece of political theater. By restoring the gods of Egypt to their temples, he presented himself not as a foreign Greek overlord, but as a pious and legitimate pharaoh, a restorer of the ancient traditions. This earned him the epithet by which he is known to history, Euergetes, the benefactor. His reign was one of peace, prosperity, and territorial expansion. The Ptolemaic navy dominated the eastern Mediterranean and the Red Sea, and its influence extended over Cyprus, the coastal cities of Asia Minor, and the islands of the Aegean. The wealth flowing into Alexandria from trade and from the immense agricultural surplus of the Nile Valley was unprecedented. This wealth funded a continuation of his father's ambitious cultural and intellectual projects. The Library and Museum of Alexandria continued to thrive, attracting the greatest minds of the Hellenistic world, including the polymath Eratosthenes, who famously calculated the circumference of the earth with remarkable accuracy, while serving as head librarian. He paid a massive deposit for their safe return, then had his scribes create exquisite new copies on the finest papiers, sent these copies back to Athens, and kept the priceless originals for the library, cheerfully forfeiting the deposit. Domestically, Ptolemy II undertook a vast program of temple construction, a policy that served both religious piety and political pragmatism. By funding these massive projects, he provided employment for thousands of Egyptians and, more importantly, secured the loyalty of the powerful and conservative native priesthood. The monumental Temple of Horus at Edfu, one of the best preserved ancient temples in Egypt today, was begun under his reign. This patronage is detailed in the Canopus Decree of 238 BCE, a trilingual inscription akin to the more famous Rosetta Stone. The decree, issued by an assembly of Egyptian priests, heaps praise upon the king and his wife, Berenice II. It extols their virtues, their dedication to the Egyptian gods, their remission of taxes, and their importation of grain to relieve a famine caused by a lone Nile flood. It is a portrait of a perfectly functioning, divinely blessed monarchy. The decree also records a fascinating attempt at calendar reform, seeking to introduce a leap year every 4 years to keep the 365-day Egyptian calendar aligned with the solar seasons, a reform that was ultimately rejected by the conservative priesthood, but demonstrated the advanced scientific thinking of the Alexandrian court. His marriage to Berenice I of Cyrene was, unlike his father's, a conventional one by Greek standards, a strategic union that brought the territory of Cyrenaica firmly into the Ptolemaic sphere. Together they were also deified while living, establishing a new ruler cult alongside the existing ones for Alexander and the Oiadelphoi. They were worshipped as the Oiuagetai, the benefactor gods, further solidifying the monarchy's divine status. Berenice I was a powerful figure in her own right, a noted horse breeder and a participant in the Olympic Games, who ruled as regent while her husband was away at war. The image projected to the world was one of perfect partnership, stability, and benevolent power. Yet, this golden age was, in many ways, a deception. The success of Ptolemy II's reign was largely a result of his personal competence, energy, and his adherence to the traditional model of a Hellenistic king established by his grandfather. He was a capable general, a skilled administrator, and a savvy diplomat. His personal strengths masked the deep seated, systemic flaws that the dynasty's structure had created. The absolute power, the divine status, the increasing isolation of the royal family from anyone outside their immediate circle, and the concentration of immense wealth were all still present. The court was still a closed system, a political pressure cooker. Ptolemy II's effective leadership kept the lid on, but the pressures inside were building. His reign was not a sustainable model, it was a temporary reprieve, an aberration of stability created by a strong hand at the tiller. He maintained the system his father created but did not reform it. Consequently, the dynasty's fate became entirely dependent on the character of the next individual to inherit this system of absolute deified and increasingly insulated power. The benefactor's reign provided a final, deceptive moment of calm before the long and precipitous decline would begin. When Ptolemy IIUAGES died in 222 BCE, the formidable system of Ptolemaic power passed to his eldest son, a young man who would take the throne as Ptolemy IV. He assumed the official royal epithet Philopator, father-lover, a title intended to publicly display his pious devotion to the memory of the great benefactor king. To contemporary and later historians, however, the title dripped with a dark irony, for the son's reign would prove to be a systematic desecration of nearly every principle the father had embodied. Where Ptolemy I was martial, energetic, and engaged in the affairs of state, Ptolemy IV was indolent, sybaritic, and utterly averse to the tedious business of governance. He was the first Ptolemy to be born and raised in the total luxury and divine insulation of the Alexandrian court. and his character was a direct product of that pampered, rarefied environment. This profound weakness in the monarch created an immediate power vacuum at the center of the kingdom, a vacuum that was eagerly filled by two of the most infamous ministers in Hellenistic history. So Eusebius was the elder of the two, a shrewd and ruthless courtier who had served under Ptolemy II, a master of bureaucratic procedure and palace intrigue. Agathocles was younger, a charismatic and ambitious man who, along with his sister Agathocles, had become an intimate companion of the young king, sharing in his decadent pleasures and gaining his absolute trust. Together these two men formed a duumvirate of corruption. They understood that their power depended entirely on their ability to control the king. To this end, they systematically isolated Ptolemy IV from any other source of influence, pandering to his every whim, encouraging his obsession with extravagant religious festivals and drunken revelries, and ensuring that the affairs of state never interfered with the monarch's pursuit of pleasure. The first and most critical business of this new shadow regime was the elimination of all potential rivals within the royal family. The court of Alexandria, for the first time, turned its murderous capabilities entirely inward. The first to be eliminated was the king's mother, the powerful and respected Queen Dowager Berenice II. A formidable figure who had ruled as regent and was the daughter of a king herself. She almost certainly opposed the corrupting influence of Eusebius and Agathocles over her son. Her presence was a threat to their control, and so she was quietly murdered, likely by poison. Next was the king's younger brother Magas. He was energetic and popular with the army, representing a clear alternative to the debauched Ptolemy IV. Eusebius fabricated a story that Magas was plotting a coup, and the young prince was scalded to death in his bath. The purge extended to Ptolemy I's uncle, Lysimachus, ensuring that no legitimate male relative of the previous generation remained as a rallying point for any opposition. With the royal family purged and the king distracted, Eusebius and Agathocles were the undisputed masters of Egypt. The court, which under the first three Ptolemies had been a center of intellectual ferment and global strategy. Ptolemy IV, a fervent devotee of the god Dionysus, spent vast sums of state revenue on ecstatic rites and lavish processions. He commissioned the construction of the Tesserae Contiers, or 40-rowed ship, a vessel of absurd proportions, described by ancient writers as over 400 feet long and requiring 4,000 oarsmen. It was not a warship but a colossal, floating palace, complete with dining halls, bedrooms, and even temples. It was a perfect monument to his reign. A monument of immense expense, breathtaking scale, and complete practical uselessness. While Ptolemy and his favorites indulged in this fantasy world, the actual kingdom began to decay. The administration grew corrupt, military readiness declined, and the formidable foreign policy of his father was abandoned. This weakness was not lost on the dynasty's great rival, the Seleucid Empire, now under the rule of the young and ambitious Antiochus II the Great, saw an opportunity to reclaim the territories lost to Ptolemy II. In 219 BC, Antiochus launched the Fourth Syrian War, invading the Ptolemaic territory of Syria. The initial response from Alexandria was sluggish and incompetent, as Eusebius and Agathocles were more concerned with court politics than national defense. The Seleucid army made significant gains, and for a time it seemed as if the decadent regime in Alexandria was on the verge of a catastrophic military defeat. The system built by the Savior King, which had reached its zenith under the benefactor, was now in the hands of the father-lover, being brought to the brink of ruin not by external forces, but by a profound and deliberate rot that had set in at its very core. Amidst the internal decay and external threats that defined the reign of Ptolemy, IV Philopator, one figure of consequence remained within the royal house. His full sister, Arsinoe, raised alongside her brother in the stultifying luxury of the palace. She was bound to him by the dynastic imperative that had been established a half-century earlier, around 220 BC. She was married to her brother, conforming to the precedent set by their great-grandparents, Ptolemy II and Arsinoe II. This union was not one of partnership or co-rule. Unlike her formidable namesake, Arsinoe was largely sidelined by her hedonistic husband and his manipulative ministers, Eusebius and Agathocles. She was a necessary component of the dynastic ideal, a sister-wife to maintain the purity of the divine bloodline, but in the early years of the reign, her political influence was intentionally and systematically suppressed. Arsinoe appears in the historical record as a stark contrast to her brother. While he was lost in Dionysian revelries and extravagant projects, she is described as a dignified and politically aware figure, keenly conscious of the dangers posed by the corruption of the court and the military threat from the Seleucid Empire. She was a constant, if powerless, presence who disapproved of the king's affair with the ambitious Agathocles and the insidious influence of her brother Agathocles. Her position was one of immense frustration and peril. As queen and sister, she possessed a status that made her a potential rallying point for any faction opposed to the ruling clique, yet she lacked the actual authority to challenge them directly. She was a captive in her own palace, a silent witness to the degradation of her family's kingdom. Her moment of historical significance arrived with the crisis of the Fourth Syrian War. As the armies of Antiochus the Great advanced relentlessly through Ptolemaic territories, the dire situation finally pierced the veil of dissipation in Alexandria. The ministers Eusebius and Agathocles, realizing their own survival was at stake, were forced to take action. They initiated a massive military recruitment and retraining program. Critically, for the first time in the dynasty's history, they armed and trained a large contingent of native Egyptian soldiers, perhaps as many as 20,000, to fight alongside the traditional Macedonian and Greek mercenary forces in the phalanx formation. This was a radical departure from previous policy, which had jealously guarded the monopoly on high-naval military power for the Greco-Macedonian elite. It was a necessary gamble to counter the numerical superiority of the Seleucid army. In 217 BCE, the Ptolemaic army, led by the king himself, marched out to confront Antiochus at the Battle of Raffiae, near the modern Gaza Strip. The presence of Ptolemy IV was a necessity for morale, but ancient sources suggest that the true force of leadership on the Ptolemaic side came from his sister-minus wife. Arsinoe rode alongside her brother, exhorting the troops before the battle. The historian Polybius records that she addressed the soldiers with tears in her eye, pleading with them to fight for the protection of themselves, their families, and their kingdom. Her presence was a powerful symbol of legitimacy and a direct appeal to the soldiers' loyalty to the royal house, not just to the corrupt ministers. The Battle of Raffiae was a massive engagement, one of the largest of the Hellenistic age. Initially, the battle went poorly for the Ptolemies. Their African elephants were routed by the larger Indian elephants of the Seleucids, and their left wing collapsed. Antiochus, in a moment of youthful overconfidence, pursued the fleeing cavalry, leaving his main phalanx exposed. Ptolemy IV, rising to the occasion for perhaps the only time in his life, rallied his central phalanx, which included the newly trained Egyptian contingent. They held their ground, then advanced, ultimately shattering the Seleucid center and securing a decisive and unexpected victory. In the aftermath of the battle, Arsinoe's prestige was at an all-time high. She had played a visible and crucial role in the salvation of the kingdom. She had also, in 220 BCE, given birth to the king's only son and heir, the future Ptolemy V, securing the succession. She was the hero of Raffiae and the mother of the next king. This newfound influence made her an even greater threat to Eusebius and the clique of Agathocles. As long as she lived, she represented an alternative source of authority, a potential regent who could one day rule on behalf of her young son. For over a decade, a tense truce existed within the palace. But upon the death of Ptolemy IV in 204 BC, a death hastened, no doubt, by his lifestyle of excess, the ministers saw their chance. Before the king's death was even announced publicly, Eusebius and Agathocles acted. According to the sources, they conspired to have Queen Arsinoe I murdered in a palace coup. The exact details are murky, but the outcome was clear. The queen who had saved the dynasty at Raffiae was eliminated in order to secure the regency over her 5-year-old son for the very men she despised. Her murder was a final, brutal act of betrayal, marking the complete ascendancy of court intrigue over dynastic loyalty and plunging the kingdom into a new and even more dangerous period of instability. The murder of Queen Arsinoe II was an act of brutal finality, executed in the shadowy corridors of the Alexandrian palace. With her death, and the passing of her indolent husband Ptolemy IV, the direct line of adult authority that had stretched back to Ptolemy I was severed. The sole inheritor of this immense and now deeply troubled kingdom was a 5-year-old boy, Ptolemy V. For a short period, the regents Sosibius and Agathocles concealed the deaths of the royal couple. They needed time to consolidate their position, to secure the loyalty of key palace guards, and to prepare their narrative. When the announcement was finally made, it was a carefully staged piece of political theatre. Agathocles and his sister Agatha presented the weeping boy king to the assembled palace troops and the people of Alexandria. They produced a fraudulent will, supposedly from the late Ptolemy IV, that named them as the child's official guardians. And for the proud Greco-Macedonian aristocracy of the capital, it was a profound humiliation. Their kingdom, the legacy of Alexander's companion, was now in the hands of a low-born mistress and her corrupt brother. This internal weakness in Alexandria did not go unnoticed by the other great powers of the Hellenistic world. The news of a child on the Egyptian throne, managed by a despised and illegitimate regency, was a signal of unparalleled opportunity. In the courts of the Seleucid Empire and the Antigonid Kingdom of Macedon, two ambitious and aggressive monarchs, Antiochus I the Great and Philip V, saw their chance to dismantle the Ptolemaic Empire once and for all. These two kings entered into a secret pact, a predatory alliance to systematically strip away Egypt's overseas territories. Philip V would target the Ptolemaic possessions in the Aegean and Asia Minor, while Antiochus I would finally seize the long-contested and wealthy region of Syria. This pact precipitated the Fifth Syrian War. The kingdom was now beset by the two most powerful military forces in the eastern Mediterranean, precisely at the moment it was most vulnerable. While the external threats gathered, the situation within Egypt itself was rapidly disintegrating. The decision to arm native Egyptians for the Battle of Raphiae had fundamentally altered the social and military balance of power. These soldiers, having played a decisive role in saving the kingdom, returned to their villages not as subservient peasants, but as trained veterans with a newfound sense of their own efficacy and importance. They had seen the weakness of their Greek masters firsthand and were no longer content with their second-class status. Compounded by years of corrupt administration and heavy taxation under Ptolemy IV, this new military confidence ignited a wave of nationalist sentiment. In the south, in Upper Egypt, a massive insurrection erupted. This was not a minor riot, it was a full-scale war of secession. The Egyptian rebels established an independent kingdom centered on the ancient capital of Thebes, crowning their own native pharaohs. The first of these was Nefer, who was succeeded by Enquen-Nefer. For nearly 20 years, a vast and economically vital portion of the country, from Abydos south to the border with Nubia, was completely outside of Ptolemaic control. This great Theban revolt was a catastrophic blow to the Alexandrian government. It deprived the treasury of immense tax revenues and disrupted the flow of goods from the south. The Ptolemaic Dynasty, which had so carefully cultivated an image of pharaonic legitimacy, now faced a rival native pharaoh who commanded the loyalty of a huge portion of its subjects. The power vacuum, therefore, was not merely at the top of the political structure. It was systemic, radiating outwards from the corrupted core in Alexandria. The boy king, who would later be given the grandiose title Epiphanes, God Manifest, was a monarch in name only. He was a prisoner of his own regents, a helpless symbol of a divine lineage whose authority was crumbling. The kingdom he inherited was under coordinated attack from powerful foreign kings, while simultaneously being torn apart from within by the largest and most successful native uprising in its history. The murder of Arsinoe I had not just eliminated a political rival for Sosibius and Agathocles, it had decapitated the state, leaving the entire Ptolemaic enterprise exposed, defenseless, and on a clear trajectory toward total collapse. The stability achieved by the first three Ptolemies had been squandered in a single generation, leaving a child to preside over the ruins. With the 5-year-old Ptolemy V as a helpless pawn and the kingdom besieged from without and within, The regency of Eusebius and Agathocles held absolute power. It was a power they had no intention of using for the benefit of the state. For them, the royal treasury was not a resource for funding armies or securing the frontiers. It was a personal fortune to be plundered. While the Ptolemaic garrisons in the Aegean were being overrun by Philip V and the armies of Antiochus, II were methodically conquering Syria, the court in Alexandria was consumed by a fever of avarice and paranoia. State funds were systematically diverted to Agathocles, his sister Agathocles, their mother Oenthna, and their small circle of sycophants. Their primary focus was the enrichment of their own family and the violent suppression of any perceived dissent. The elder statesman of this corrupt enterprise, Eusebius, soon faded from the historical record, likely dying of old age, leaving Agathocles as the sole, undisputed master of the regency. His rule was characterized by a profound and catastrophic incompetence. Diplomatically, he dispatched envoys to Rome, seeking the Republic's intervention against the aggression of Philip and Antiochus. This was a pivotal moment, an implicit admission that the Ptolemaic kingdom could no longer defend its own interests and was now reliant on the rising power in the West. While the Romans issued stern warnings to the other Hellenistic kings, their attention was primarily focused on their recent victory over Hannibal, and their response was slow and largely ineffective in the short term. Militarily, the response to the invasions was weak and disorganized, leading to the critical loss of Ptolemaic territories in Asia Minor and the decisive defeat at the Battle of Ptolemais in 200 BCE, which permanently ceded Syria to the Seleucids. Within Alexandria, Agathocles ruled by fear. He targeted the established Greco-Macedonian aristocracy, men who had served the dynasty for generations and who viewed him as an illegitimate usurper. Anyone whose loyalty was suspect or whose influence was seen as a threat was liable to be arrested on fabricated charges, stripped of their wealth, and executed. The royal court, once a bastion of Hellenic culture, became a nest of spies and informants. This tyranny was compounded by the regent's public behavior, which was an open insult to the citizens of the capital. Agathocles was frequently seen in a drunken stupor, neglecting all his duties. His sister Agathocles wielded her influence with undisguised arrogance, while their mother held lavish, gluttonous feasts. The family behaved not as sober custodians of a divine monarchy in crisis, but as lottery winners on a reckless spending spree. This blatant disrespect for the dignity of the throne, combined with the news of military defeats and the ongoing humiliation of their nation, fostered a deep and simmering resentment among both the common people and the military establishment. The breaking point came in 203 BCE. The catalyst was the rising influence of Ptolemies, the Ptolemaic general in charge of the strategically vital garrison at Pelusium, the gateway to Egypt from the east. He was a respected military man who openly despised the corrupt regency. When Agathocles attempted to have him removed, Ptolemies marched his army towards Alexandria, and the city rose up to join him. In a single night, the carefully constructed edifice of fear that Agathocles had built collapsed. The city's populace, along with the royal guard, united in their hatred for the regent, surged through the streets. A mob of soldiers and civilians stormed the palace, their objective being the liberation of the boy king. What followed was a scene of visceral, revolutionary justice. The mob demanded that the young Ptolemy be brought out to them. Terrified, the palace officials complied, handing the child over to the crowd's leaders. His person secured, the mob's fury was unleashed upon Agathocles and his family. According to Polybius, Agathocles was found in a state of drunken panic and was killed by his former friends, eager to ingratiate themselves with the new powers. His sister Agathocles and their mother Oenthna, along with their other relatives, sought sanctuary in a temple. But there was no sanctuary for them. They were dragged out stripped naked and delivered to the enraged populace in the city's stadium. There, before the eyes of the entire city, they were beaten, stabbed, and torn to pieces. The violent overthrow of Agathocles and his clique was a cathartic explosion of popular rage, but it did not solve the fundamental problem. It merely replaced one set of masters with another. The general Ptolemies assumed the role of regent, but he proved to be a capable soldier with little aptitude for administration. He squandered state funds on lavish payments to his troops and engaged in petty diplomatic squabbles. The power vacuum at the heart of the kingdom remained, now filled by competing military strongmen and ambitious courtiers, all vying for control over the young king. The cycle of instability had simply entered a new, more chaotic phase. The murder of the regents was not a restoration of order. It was merely a symptom of the disease that was now endemic to the Ptolemaic state. The violent exorcism of Agathocles and his clique did not restore stability to the Ptolemaic kingdom. It merely created a new set of competing factions vying for control of the boy king, Ptolemy V. The regency passed first to the general Ptolemus and then to a courtier named Aristomenes, but the fundamental weaknesses of the state remained. The Great Theban revolt raged in the south, and the disastrous Fifth Syrian War had resulted in the permanent loss of Syria to the Seleucid Empire under Antiochus II. The Battle of Ptolemais in 200 BC was a humiliating defeat that shattered the myth of Ptolemaic military supremacy. The kingdom was broken, its treasury depleted, and its international prestige at a nadir. It was in this context of profound desperation that the court in Alexandria pursued a diplomatic solution that would have been unlinkable to their powerful ancestors. They sought peace through a marriage alliance with their most hated enemy. This union was a radical departure from established dynastic practice. For the first time since the dynasty's founding, a Ptolemaic king would take a wife who was not of Macedonian aristocratic stock, but a princess from a rival Hellenistic empire, the young daughter of the victorious Seleucid king, Antiochus II. The marriage was formally agreed to around 197 BCE, a key provision in the peace treaty that ended the war. For Antiochus, it was a strategic masterstroke. It secured his southern border, allowing him to turn his attention towards his ambitions in Asia Minor and Greece. More importantly, it inserted his own daughter into the very heart of the Ptolemaic court, a potential conduit for Seleucid influence for a generation to come. Some ancient sources even claim that Antiochus promised Syria as part of Cleopatra's dowry, a cynical and ultimately empty promise designed to placate the Egyptians, while he solidified his control over the territory. For the Ptolemaic court, the marriage was a bitter pill to swallow, an open admission of their diminished status. Yet, it was a necessary one. It brought a formal end to a ruinous war and provided a much-needed period of external peace to focus on the pressing internal crisis of the native revolt. The marriage itself was solemnized in 193 BCE, when Ptolemy V was about 16 years old and his bride was a girl of around 10. She arrived in Egypt as Cleopatra Isira, the Syrian, a name that forever marked her as a foreign import. She was, however, the first of her name to sit on the Egyptian throne, a name with deep roots in the Macedonian homeland, and one that would become inextricably and infamously linked with the dynasty's final chapter. Cleopatra's arrival marked a significant shift in the court's internal dynamics. Unlike the sister-minus wives of previous generations, her first loyalty was not necessarily to the Ptolemaic house but to her Seleucid lineage. She was a politically astute and capable individual, and over the course of her marriage, she garnered considerable respect and influence. She bore her husband 3 children who would survive to adulthood. A son, the future Ptolemy VI, a daughter, who would become Cleopatra II, and another son, the future Ptolemy VII. This trio of siblings would dominate the next, even bloodier, phase of the dynasty's history. In 100 BC, Ptolemy V, now a young man, finally succeeded in crushing the Great Theban revolt with extreme brutality, restoring unity to the kingdom. His coronation as pharaoh, an event delayed for years by the turmoil, was commemorated by the famous Memphis Decree, inscribed on the stela now known as the Rosetta Stone. With the internal rebellion suppressed, he began to plan a new war to reclaim Syria from his wife's family. However, his death in 180 BC, at only 30 years of age, cut these plans short. His passing is shrouded in suspicion. Sources suggest he may have been poisoned by his own generals, who feared the financial cost and risk of a new major war. The premature death of Ptolemy V catapulted his widow into a position of unprecedented power. Her eldest son, Ptolemy VI, was only 6 years old. Cleopatra I Syra became the sole regent of the kingdom, the first Ptolemaic queen to wield such undisputed authority. She was styled Thea Epiphanes, the manifest goddess, and her name appeared in official documents before that of the boy king. In a complete reversal of her late husband's policy, she immediately ended all preparations for war against the Seleucids. As a Seleucid princess by birth, she pursued a policy of peace and reconciliation with her brother, Seleucus IV, who now ruled the rival empire. Her regency was a brief period of calm and competent administration, a welcome respite from the chaos that had preceded it. She proved to be a far more capable ruler than the husband she had been forced to marry. However, her stabilizing presence was short-lived. Her death in 176 BC, removed the last effective and authoritative adult from the center of power, leaving her 3 young children, 2 boys and a girl, as wards of the court, to be managed by a new pair of ambitious and catastrophically inept regents. The death of the regent Cleopatra I Syra in 176 BCE plunged the kingdom back into the familiar state of instability that defined the reign of a child monarch. Her eldest son, now around 10 years old, was officially the ruler, Ptolemy VI Philomet, or he who loves his mother, a title chosen to honor the memory of the capable queen. But like his father before him, he was a king in name only. Real power fell into the hands of 2 new regents, Iulius and Linnaeus. Iulius was a eunuch who had been the young king's tutor, while Linnaeus was a Syrian slave of low birth. Both were profoundly unqualified for the positions they now held. Driven by a combination of arrogance and nationalist fervor, they harbored a deep resentment towards the Seleucid Empire, the very power from which the late Queen Regent had sprung. They saw her peaceful foreign policy as a national humiliation and began to agitate for a new war to reclaim the lost province of Syria. Their aggressive posturing was profoundly foolish. The Seleucid throne was now occupied by one of the most formidable rulers of the age, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the brother of the late Cleopatra I. He was a cunning, unenergetic king with a powerful battle-hardened army. The regents in Alexandria, in their hubris, grossly underestimated him. They ignored the advice of seasoned diplomats and began making public demands for the return of the province, essentially daring the Seleucid king to retaliate. To further consolidate their power and create a veneer of dynastic legitimacy, they arranged the marriage of the young Ptolemy VI to his full sister, Cleopatra II. Around 175 BC, the king was 11, the queen perhaps a year or 2 older. This establishment of sibling marriage, after the interlude of a foreign queen, was a return to the dynasty's foundational practice, a symbolic turning inward as they prepared for external conflict. In 170 BC, Iulius and Linnaeus formally declared war on the Seleucid Empire, launching the Sixth Syrian War. The result was an immediate and unmitigated disaster. Antiochus IV was more than prepared for the attack. He met the Ptolemaic army near Pelusium, the heavily fortified gateway to the Egyptian delta, and utterly crushed it. The regent's grand war plan collapsed at the first encounter. Antiochus seized Pelusium and then marched, virtually unopposed, up the Nile. The catastrophic defeat led to a coup. Iulius and Linnaeus were overthrown, and the teenage Ptolemy VI was briefly declared of age, though he was little more than a puppet of the military commanders who now ran the government. Antiochus IV's advance was relentless. He captured the young king Ptolemy VI at Memphis, though he treated him with a strange leniency. As the boy's maternal uncle, Antiochus claimed he was acting not as a conqueror, but as a protector of his young nephew's interests against his corrupt advisors. This was a transparent fiction. He had Ptolemy VI crowned as king in Memphis in the traditional Egyptian manner, effectively turning him into a Seleucid vassal. He then proceeded to systematically plunder the Nile Delta. In Alexandria, however, the populace refused to submit. In a revolutionary move, they declared Ptolemy VI deposed and proclaimed his younger brother as the new king. Ptolemy VI, the younger brother, a boy of about 10, was given the epithet Urgetusii, though he would become better known to history by the vicious nickname Viscon, or Potbelly, a reference to the morbid obesity he would develop in later life. The situation was now one of surreal complexity. Egypt had two kings. Ptolemy VI ruled from Memphis as a client of the invading Seleucid king, while his younger brother, Ptolemy VII, ruled from a besieged Alexandria, ruling with their sister, Cleopatra II. Antiochus IV laid siege to Alexandria, but was unable to take the heavily fortified city. Facing mounting internal problems in his own empire, he eventually withdrew from Egypt in 116 BCE, but he made sure to leave the country in a state of terminal division, keeping a garrison at Pelis, and encouraging the rivalry between the two brothers. He rightly calculated that a weak and divided Egypt, consumed by civil war, would pose no threat to him. As soon as Antiochus was gone, a reconciliation was brokered, likely by their sister Cleopatra II. The two brothers and their sister agreed to rule jointly from Alexandria. The government was officially a tripartite monarchy, a dysfunctional triumvirate of an eagle, Ptolemy VI, a vulture, Ptolemy VII, and a cobra, Cleopatra I. The joint reign was a period of constant, simmering tension. The two brothers were fundamentally incompatible. Ptolemy VI was generalist-mannered and inclined to clemency, while the younger Ptolemy VII was ambitious, violent, and ruthless. Their sister Queen, Cleopatra II, now the wife of the elder brother but the co-ruler of both, was caught in the middle, attempting to mediate their endless disputes. This unstable arrangement was a recipe for disaster, turning the palace into a hotbed of conspiracy as each brother's faction sought to undermine the other. The invasion had failed to conquer Egypt, but it had succeeded in poisoning the royal family, setting the stage for decades of fratricidal conflict. The tripartite rule of two brothers and a sister was an inherently unstable political compound, destined to decompose. The years following the withdrawal of Antiochus IV were marked by relentless intrigue within the Alexandrian palace. The younger brother, Ptolemy VI Physcon, was a force of pure ambition and brutality. He chafed under the seniority of his brother, Ptolemy VI, and actively worked to build his own power base, courting the ever-fickle Alexandrian mob factions within the army. By 164 BCE, Physcon's plotting paid off. He successfully managed to incite the populace against his brother, forcing Ptolemy VI into a humiliating exile. The elder king, stripped of his power and his kingdom, fled not to a rival Hellenistic court, but to Rome, where he made a pathetic spectacle of himself, appealing to the Senate in a shabby robe to intervene and restore him to his throne. Ptolemy VI's first taste of sole power revealed his true nature. His rule in Alexandria was so oppressive, arbitrary, and violent that he quickly alienated the very people who had helped him seize the throne. His cruelty became the subject of horrified gossip throughout the Hellenistic world. He was a tyrant in the most classical sense, ruling by fear and executing anyone he suspected of disloyalty. His brief reign was a disaster, and within a year, the Alexandria, welcoming his older brother back. The Roman Senate, sensing an opportunity to deepen its influence over the chaotic kingdom, mediated a settlement. Ptolemy VI was restored to the throne in Egypt and Cyprus. Ptolemy VI was given his own, separate kingdom to rule. The wealthy territory of Cyrenaica, on the coast of modern-day Libya, this partition was designed to separate the two warring brothers and bring a measure of stability. It failed completely. Ptolemy VI was not content with Cyrenaica. From his new capital, he almost immediately began plotting to seize the valuable island of Cyprus from his brother. He made multiple trips to Rome, lobbying the Senate to support his claim and portraying himself as a victim of his brother's aggression. The Romans, practicing their well-honed strategy of divide et impere, divide and rule, vacillated, sometimes offering him tacit support, at other times rebuffing him, always ensuring that the two brothers remained hostile and dependent on Roman arbitration. In one failed attempt to conquer Cyprus around 155 BC, Ptolemy VI was captured by his elder brother. In a moment of extraordinary clemency that would prove to be a fatal mistake, Ptolemy VI pardoned his younger brother, escorted him back to Cyrene, and reaffirmed his rule there, hoping this act of mercy would finally end the conflict. It did not. The conflict only ended with the death of Ptolemy I in 145 BCE. The elder king died in battle in Syria, ironically after intervening in a Seleucid civil war. His death created an immediate succession crisis in Alexandria. His heir was a young son, Ptolemy Aeneas Philopator. The boy's mother and the dynasty's long suffering matriarch, Cleopatra II, immediately took power as regent for her son. But from Cyrene, Ptolemy I Physcon saw his ultimate chance. The throne of Egypt was finally within his grasp. He mobilized his forces and made it clear he intended to claim the kingdom. Faced with the prospect of a devastating civil war against a notoriously ruthless opponent, a grim compromise was reached. Ptolemy I would return to Alexandria. He would be crowned king and, in a move of stunning political expediency, he would marry his own sister, Cleopatra I, the widow of the brother he had spent his life trying to depose. This union was intended to unify the two warring factions of the family and legitimize his rule. Like seeing it as the only way to protect her son's future claim, agreed to the marriage. It was a pact with the devil. Ptolemy I entered Alexandria as its new pharaoh. On the very day of his wedding feast, to eliminate any possible rival for the throne, he had his young nephew and stepson, the boy King Ptolemy I, assassinated in the arms of his mother. The murder was a public and brutal statement of intent. There would be no more mercy, no more compromise. The benefactor in name but the bloated tyrant in practice had truly begun. His rule would become a new benchmark for cruelty, paranoia, and familial betrayal, a long and bloody chapter from which the dynasty would never fully recover. The marriage of Ptolemy I Physcon to his sister, Cleopatra II, was not a union of reconciliation. It was the beginning of a prolonged and venomous political siege within the walls of the Alexandrian palace. Cleopatra I was a woman of immense pride and experience. She had been queen for over a quarter of a century, had ruled in the dysfunctional triumvirate, and had served as regent for her murdered son. She despised the man who was now both her brother and her husband, the man who had killed her child on their wedding day. She viewed him as a brutish usurper, and he viewed her as a constant, simmering threat, a living reminder of his brother's legitimate line. For over a decade, they coexisted in a state of mutual hatred, a dysfunctional royal couple presiding over a court paralyzed by fear and suspicion. Ptolemy I's reign was a systematic purge of the Alexandrian intellectual and social elite. He distrusted the city's famously independent and often rebellious citizens, and he held a particular contempt for the Greek scholars and aristocrats who had, in his view, supported his elder brother. The historian Polybius, a contemporary, provides a chilling account of his tyranny. Mercenaries loyal only to the king roamed the streets, enforcing his will. Prominent citizens were arrested on trumped-up charges, their property confiscated, and they were either executed or forced into exile. He is said to have conducted a wholesale massacre of the young men of the city's gymnasium. This brutal suppression of the Greek establishment led to a mass exodus of talent from Alexandria. Scholars, poets, artists, and physicians fled the city, scattering across the Mediterranean. One ancient writer remarked that Physcon had succeeded only in educating the rest of the world, as every city was now filled with the learned men he had driven out of Egypt. The breaking point in the toxic royal marriage came around 140 BC. In an act of profound personal and political provocation, Ptolemy I took a second wife. This new wife was none other than his niece, the daughter of his wife Cleopatra I and his deceased brother Ptolemy I. This young woman was also named Cleopatra. She would become Cleopatra. He would become Cleopatra I. The king married his niece without divorcing her mother. He was now simultaneously the husband of his sister's daughter. This polygamous and incestuous arrangement was an unprecedented and deeply offensive act, even by the twisted standards of the Ptolemaic Dynasty. For Cleopatra I, it was the ultimate humiliation. She was now forced to share her throne and her husband with her own child. This created an intolerable 3-way power structure in the court. At the top was the tyrannical king, Ptolemy VII. Beneath him were two rival queens. The elder, spurned mother, Cleopatra II. Then the younger, favored daughter, Cleopatra II. The two women were set against each other in a bitter struggle for influence and precedence. For years, official documents and decrees were issued in the names of all three monarchs, a bizarre testament to the fractured state of the royal family. Cleopatra II began to bear children for the king, including to future kings, providing a new line of succession that further marginalized her mother. By 132 BCE, the simmering hatred erupted into open civil war. The city of Alexandria, which had long suffered under Physcon's brutal rule, finally exploded in rebellion, ran into the cause of the senior queen, Cleopatra II. The mob set fire to the palace, and Ptolemy VII, along with his young wife Cleopatra II and their children, was forced to flee the capital. They escaped to the island of Cyprus, which remained loyal to him. Cleopatra I was proclaimed the sole ruler of Egypt, the undisputed queen. For a brief period, it seemed as if the long-suffering sister had finally triumphed over her monstrous brother. She had the support of the capital, the loyalty of the Greek community, and the legitimacy of being the last surviving child of Ptolemy V. But she had underestimated the depths of her brother's capacity for cruelty and his unquenchable thirst for revenge. Ptolemy VII Physcon began to plot a retribution so horrific it would become one of the most infamous acts of personal cruelty in the annals of ancient history. The civil war that erupted in 132 BCE was not a conflict between two conventional armies, but a bitter struggle between two halves of a fractured family. From her position in Alexandria, Cleopatra II controlled the capital, the royal treasury, and the state's administrative apparatus. She had the backing of the Greek population of the city, who despised her brother for his years of tyranny. From his stronghold on Cyprus, Ptolemy VII Physcon commanded a loyal mercenary army. The island's considerable resources and the allegiance of the native Egyptian population in the countryside, who had long resented the Greco-Macedonian dominance of Alexandria. Egypt was now split, with the native Egyptians in the Quora, the rural areas, largely siding with the king against the Greek capital, which had rallied to his sister-queen. Caught in the middle of this familial schism was a boy of approximately 12 years of age. He was Ptolemy Mphites, the only son of Ptolemy VII and Cleopatra II. His name itself, Mphites, linking him to the ancient pharaonic capital of Memphis, was a powerful symbol of legitimacy. When Physcon fled Alexandria, the young prince had been with him in the palace and was taken along to Cyprus. He was thus a hostage of his own father, the key to the future of her independent reign. In Alexandria, she began to make political overtures suggesting that Ptolemy Mphites should be recognized as the new king, presumably with her as his regent. This was a direct challenge to her brother's legitimacy, an attempt to replace him with his own son. For Ptolemy VII, this was an intolerable threat. The existence of his son, now being used as a political tool by his mother, represented a potent alternative to his own rule. Any faction in Egypt looking for a compromise candidate could rally around the boy. As long as Ptolemy Mphites lived, Physcon's claim to the throne was not absolute. Driven by a combination of strategic calculation and a deep, pathological need for revenge against the sister who had deposed him, the king decided upon a course of action that would permanently sever this political threat and simultaneously inflict the maximum possible psychological damage upon his rival. The ancient sources, particularly the historian Diodorus Siculus, describe an event of calculated monstrosity. Ptolemy VII lured his son, Ptolemy Mphites, into his presence. Then, in an act of supreme betrayal, he had the boy murdered. This was not a quiet poisoning or a discreet assassination. It was a prelude to the main event. Following the murder, the king ordered the child's body to be systematically dismembered. The limbs and torso were then carefully packed into a chest, containing the butchered remains of the queen's son, was then dispatched by ship to Alexandria. The king's instructions were precise and imbued with a theatrical cruelty. The chest was to be delivered to the palace and presented to Cleopatra I on the evening of her birthday, during the feast she would be holding to celebrate. The plan was executed perfectly. As the queen and her court were celebrating, the grim package from her brother minus husband arrived. When it was opened, the assembled guests were confronted with the dismembered body of the young prince. The act was not merely an assassination, it was a form of political communication at its most barbaric. It was a message, delivered in the most visceral terms possible, of Ptolemy VI's absolute ruthlessness. He was demonstrating to his sister, and to the world, that there was no line he would not cross, no bond of kinship he would not violate, to reclaim his power. He was not just eliminating a rival claimant, he was attempting to psychologically destroy the rival queen. In Alexandria, the immediate effect was not the terror-induced submission that Physcon may have intended. Instead, it was an explosion of pure horror and revulsion. The atrocity galvanized the population's hatred for him. Cleopatra II, in a moment of grim political theater, is said to have displayed the remains of her son to the people of Alexandria, inciting their fury and solidifying their resolve to resist the tyrant at all costs. The murder of Ptolemy Mphites erased any possibility of a negotiated settlement or a reconciliation. The war, which had begun as a political power struggle, now became a blood feud, a deeply personal vendetta fueled by an unforgivable act of filicide. The dynasty had descended into a new circle of darkness, one from which there could be no return. The horrific act of filicide and mutilation did not, as Ptolemy VI Physcon may have hoped, break his sister's will. Instead, it consecrated their conflict in blood, transforming a political war into an existential feud. For several years following the murder of Ptolemy Mphites, the civil war ground on. Cleopatra held the formidable city of Alexandria, a fortress with its own fleet and access to the sea, allowing it to be supplied by her eyes. Ptolemy VII, alongside his niece minus wife Cleopatra III, controlled the vast majority of the Egyptian countryside, the Kora. His power base was rooted in the native Egyptian population, whom he courted, and the powerful temple priesthoodess, whose support was crucial for long-term control of the kingdom's wealth. The war devolved into a grinding stalemate. Alexandria was too strong to be taken by assault, but Cleopatra I lacked the military strength to project her power beyond the city's walls and reconquer the rest of the country. This protracted conflict was devastating for Egypt. It disrupted the agricultural cycle, crippled trade, and drained the treasury on both sides as they hired expensive mercenary armies. All the while, the younger queen, Cleopatra III, remained firmly at her husband's side. She was a key asset in his political arsenal. While her mother represented the past, the legacy of Ptolemy VI and the murdered Ptolemy VII, Cleopatra II represented the future. She was young, fearful, and had already provided Ptolemy VII with new heirs, including two sons, the future Ptolemy IX and Ptolemy IX and Ptolemy X. Her presence gave his regime a crucial veneer of dynastic continuity. For the powerful courtiers and military commanders outside Alexandria, she represented a viable, alternative matriarch to her aging and increasingly isolated mother. Slowly, inexorably, the strategic reality began to turn against Cleopatra II. While she held the capital, her resources were finite. Physcon controlled the source of Egypt's wealth, the grain miners producing lands of the Nile. As the years passed, the resolve of the Alexandria began to fray. The initial outrage over the murder of the prince faded, replaced by the grim realities of a prolonged siege economy. Food shortages, commercial decline, and the constant threat of a bloody final assault. Cleopatra I's position had become untenable. Support within the city had eroded to the point of collapse. Facing imminent defeat and capture by the brother she knew would show her no mercy, she was forced to flee Egypt. Her destination was the court of her former son -in-law, the Seleucid king Demetrius II, where she hoped to rally foreign support to continue her fight. With his sister finally driven into exile, Ptolemy VII made his triumphant return to Alexandria. The city that had expelled him and defied him for 5 years was now his to command. He brought his niece minus wife, Cleopatra II, with him, installing her as his undisputed queen consort. He immediately unleashed another wave of brutal purges, systematicing or exiling anyone who had supported her mother's cause. The city was once again brought to heel by terror. It appeared the conflict was over. The tyrant had won. However, the situation remained dangerously unstable. Cleopatra II, though exiled, was not defeated. From the Seleucid court, she remained a potent political symbol, a legitimate Ptolemaic queen who could, with throne backing, return to ignite yet another civil war. This external threat made it impossible for Physcon to rule with any sense of security. It was this lingering danger that led to one of the most bizarre and chilling political resolutions in the history of the dynasty, around 124 BC. After nearly a decade of open warfare and unforgivable atrocities, a public reconciliation was announced. An amnesty decree was issued, pardoning all crimes committed during the war. Cleopatra I was invited to return to Egypt from her exile. She accepted. She returned to Alexandria and was formally reinstated as a co-minus ruler. The government was once again a triumvirate, its decrees issued in the names of King Ptolemy VII, the senior Queen Cleopatra II, and the junior Queen Cleopatra II. This was not an act of forgiveness. It was a political solution of breathtaking cynicism. It was a cold peace, born of mutual exhaustion and the realization that none of them could afford another war. The mother now had to sit in council and share power with the man who had dismembered her son. She had to rule alongside the daughter, who had usurped her position and married her murderer. The daughter, in turn, had to share her authority with the mother she had helped doctor into exile, and the king had to share his throne with the two women who hated him and each other with a passion forged in betrayal and blood. The family was now permanently locked together in a grotesque parody of unity, a trinity of mutual loathing, bound by the very crimes that should have torn them apart forever. The reconciliation of 124 BCE ushered in the final, strangest phase of Ptolemy VII Physcon's reign. For 8 years the kingdom was governed by the impossible trinity of the king, his sister minus wife Cleopatra II, and his niece minus wife Cleopatra II. The palace in Alexandria, the scene of so many murders and betrayals, settled into a cold, quiet hostility. It was a government born of exhaustion, a truce held together by mutual distrust. Their conjoined titles a public mask for a private reality of irreconcilable hatred. This period of tense stability was, however, entirely dependent on the life of one man. When Ptolemy VII, bloated, diseased, and universally despised, finally died in 116 BCE, the artificial peace shattered, and the dynasty's pathologies were passed down, fully formed, to the next generation. The instrument of this new crisis was the king's last will and testament. In a final, posthumous act of political manipulation, Physcon did not bequeath his kingdom to his eldest son, as tradition would dictate. Instead, he left the throne of Egypt to his wife, Cleopatra II, with the unprecedented provision that she should rule alongside whichever of her two sons she chose. This was a masterstroke of destabilization. It bypassed the principle of primogeniture, empowered the queen matriarch to an extraordinary degree, and formally established her two sons as rivals. It was a political inheritance engineered to foster jealousy and conflict, ensuring that the mother would be the ultimate arbiter of power. The two sons in question were Ptolemy the Elder and Alexander the Younger. The elder son, who would take the throne as Ptolemy IX, was known by the official epithet Soterai I, but was given the derogatory nickname Lathias, meaning chickpea, by the Alexandrian court. He appears to have been more independent and was perhaps favored by his grandmother, the senior Queen Cleopatra II. The youngest son, Ptolemy X, who would later take the name Alexander Roy, was by all accounts his mother's favorite. He was more pliable, more reliant on her, and thus from her perspective, a far more desirable co-minus ruler. Cleopatra II's preference was clear. She wanted to enthrone her younger, more controllable son, Ptolemy X. However, she was constrained by powerful forces. The Alexandrian populace and the traditional court establishment, weary of the arbitrary rule of Physcon, demanded a semblance of order and legitimacy. They insisted that the rights of the firstborn be respected. Bowing to this pressure, Cleopatra II was forced to accept her elder son, Ptolemaic Dynasty, as her co-ruler. From the very first day of their reign, the relationship was defined by her resentment and his wary assertion of his own authority. Cleopatra, II, was now co-ruler with the king. She did not want and could not easily control. She immediately set about rectifying this situation using the same tools of familial manipulation that had defined her own rise to power. Her first target was her son's marriage. Ptolemaic was already married to his full sister, a common practice by this point, a woman named Cleopatra IV. The couple was apparently close, and the queen represented a source of independence, a potent influence for her husband minus brother. For Cleopatra II, this was an unacceptable political variable. In a chilling echo of how her own father had humiliated her mother, Cleopatra II forcibly dissolved the marriage. She compelled Ptolemy IX to divorce his sister minus wife Cleopatra IV and marry their younger, presumably more docile, sister Cleopatra Selene. This act was a brutal and public demonstration of her continued dominance. It was designed to isolate her son, stripping him of his most intimate ally and replacing her with one of his mother's choosing. The spurned Cleopatra IV fled to Cyprus and then to Syria, where she would inject the Ptolemaic tradition of incestuous and fratricidal intrigue into the already chaotic politics of the Seleucid dynasty. Having managed her disfavored son, Cleopatra II now had to deal with her favored one. She could not keep Ptolemy X in Alexandria, where his presence would serve as a constant reminder of her frustrated ambitions and a potential rallying point for her own faction. He was both an asset and a liability. Her solution was strategic exile. She sent Ptolemy X to Cyprus, not as a punishment, but to govern the island as its king. This removed him from the volatile politics of the capital, kept him safely under her sphere of influence, and preserved him as a king in reserve, ready to be recalled to Egypt at the opportune moment. The final piece of the old order, the formidable dowager, Queen Cleopatra II, died shortly after Physcon, within the first year of the new reign. Her death removed the last major figure from the previous generation, the last check on Cleopatra II's ambition. She was now the sole, undisputed matriarch of the dynasty, a position of supreme power she had spent a lifetime scheming to achieve. The stage was now perfectly set for the next chapter of the family's self-destruction. A resentful mother ruled alongside a son she actively sought to undermine. On Cyprus, a favored son waited patiently, his claim to the throne legitimized by his mother's preference and his father's will. The family was not a cohesive unit. It was a political chessboard, and the queen was playing her sons against each other like pawns in a game for absolute control. The co-regency of Cleopatra II and her unwanted elder son, Ptolemaic Dynasty, was a decade-long masterclass in maternal sabotage. From 116 to 107 BCE, the court in Alexandria was paralyzed by a cold war between mother and son. Cleopatra II systematically worked to undermine her son's authority at every turn, while Dynasty attempted to carve out a sphere of independent action. But this public display of unity lost a deeply dysfunctional reality. The queen matriarch held the real power. She controlled the treasury, commanded the loyalty of key ministers and military commanders, and was beloved by the Alexandrian populace, who saw her as the true heir to Physcon's authority. Dynasty was king, but he was a king on a leash, constantly checked and thwarted by the machinations of his own mother. The central conflict of their reign was foreign policy. Dynasty sought to reassert Ptolemaic influence abroad, particularly in the collapsing Seleucid Empire, which was consumed by its own endless civil wars. He saw an opportunity to intervene in a conflict in Judea, supporting one faction against another, in a move that would have established an Egyptian presence in the long-lost territory of Syria. This independent action was anathema to Cleopatra III. It was not that she necessarily disagreed with the policy on its merits. She opposed it because it was his policy. A successful military campaign would bring her some prestige, the loyalty of the army, and a power base independent of her control. This she could not permit. She actively worked to sabotage his efforts, withholding funds and support, and ultimately forcing him to abandon his campaign. Her campaign of destabilization culminated in 107 BC. Having spent 10 years chipping away at her son's support, she finally orchestrated a coup. She appeared before the people of Alexandria, claiming to have been wounded in an assassination attempt which she accused Lathius of plotting. Whether there was any truth to the accusation is highly doubtful. It was almost certainly a piece of theatrical propaganda. But it was effective. She whipped the notoriously volatile Alexandrian mob into a frenzy. Riots erupted, and Ptolemaic Lathius was forced to flee the city for his life, abandoning his throne, his wife Cleopatra Sibling, and his children. He escaped to Cyprus, the very island his younger brother had just been governing. With Lathius deposed and in exile, Cleopatra's long-held plan came to fruition. She summoned her favored younger son, Ptolemaic Alexander, from Cyprus to Alexandria. He was installed as the new king and co-minus ruler. She had finally achieved her desired political arrangement. A partnership with a son who was utterly dependent on her and owed his crown entirely to her. To cement this new order, she forced her new king-minus son to divorce his existing wife and marry the woman Lathius had left behind, his sister and Lathius's former wife, Cleopatra Sibling. The family tree had become a tangled, repeating knot of forced marriages and dissolved unions, all serving the political ambitions of the matriarch. This victory, however, created a new and dangerous dynamic. The two-kingdom problem. Ptolemaic Lathius was not content to remain a quiet exile. Upon arriving in Cyprus, he quickly took control of the island, which had been his brother's domain. He now possessed a secure base of operations, his own army, and his own source of revenue. The Ptolemaic Empire was once again split, just as it had been during the war between Physcon and Cleopatra. In Alexandria, Cleopatra and Ptolemaic ruled Egypt. From Cyprus, the exiled Ptolemaic ruled a rival Ptolemaic kingdom, biding his time and waiting for an opportunity to return. This division led to a bizarre and protracted shadow war fought not on Egyptian soil, but through proxy conflicts in Judea and Syria. Both Ptolemaic factions intervened in local wars, supporting opposite sides, with Lathius leading his Cypriot army on campaigns in Palestine, and Cleopatra sending the Egyptian army to counter him. It was a fratricidal conflict fought at a distance, a testament to the family's complete inability to resolve its internal disputes. For nearly 20 years, this strange and unstable equilibrium held. Lathius remained the exiled king in Cyprus, a constant threat on the horizon. In Alexandria, Ptolemaic ruled under the thumb of his powerful mother, their relationships souring as he grew to resent her overbearing control. The dynasty was in a state of suspended animation, caught in a repeating cycle of maternal domination, fraternal rivalry, and exile, a pattern from which it seemed utterly incapable of escaping. The co-minus rule of Cleopatra and her favored son, Ptolemaic Alexander, which she had schemed for decades to achieve, ultimately curdled into the very thing she sought to avoid. As Ptolemaic grew older, he began to resent his mother's absolute control over every aspect of his reign. He was a king in title, but a puppet in practice. The tension between them escalated until, in 101 BC, the breaking point was reached. Weary of being his mother's creature, ordered her assassination. After a lifetime of manipulating sons, pitting brother against brother, and orchestrating coups, the great matriarch Cleopatra was murdered at the behest of the son she had placed on the throne. The act was a brutal finality, the logical endpoint of the political school she herself had founded. With his mother gone, Ptolemaic was the sole, undisputed ruler of Egypt. His reign was characterized by weakness and profligacy. He was deeply unpopular with both the Alexandrian populace and the army, who saw him as an illegitimate superundum at Ricide. He squandered the kingdom's dwindling wealth and became increasingly dependent on Roman financiers to prop up his unstable regime. His grip on power was tenuous, maintained only by mercenary force and the absence of a viable alternative. That alternative was still biding his time on Cyprus. For years, the exiled Ptolemaic Lathius had ruled the island kingdom, a constant, looming threat to his brother in Alexandria. Around 88 BCE, the long simmering resentment in Egypt finally boiled over. A popular uprising, supported by the army, drove Ptolemaics out of Alexandria. The people then did what they had done 20 years prior. They recalled the elder brother. Ptolemaic Lathyrus, now a grizzled veteran in his late 50s, returned from his long exile and reclaimed his throne, this time as the sole and undisputed king of Egypt. His usurping brother Ptolemaic fled with his wife and a substantial portion of the royal treasury, attempting to hire a new mercenary army to retake the kingdom. His efforts failed, and he was killed in a naval battle off the coast of Cyprus the same year. Ptolemaic's second reign was a period of relative calm, but it was the calm of exhaustion. The kingdom was a shadow of its former self. Its overseas empire was gone, its treasury was empty, and its politics were now inextricably entangled with the rising power of Rome. A particularly damaging event during this period was the sack of Thebes. The ancient southern capital, which had a long history of rebellion, rose up one last time against Ptolemaic rule. Lathyrus besieged the city for 3 years and, upon its fall, subjected it to a brutal and systematic destruction from which it never recovered. It was a final, violent assertion of Alexandrian dominance over the native Egyptian heartland. When Ptolemaic Lathyrus died of natural causes in 81 or 80 BCE, he left behind no legitimate descendant of his line was his daughter, Baroness II. She was the child of his first sister-wife, Cleopatra IV, and had remained in Alexandria when he was exiled. She had even been married for a time to her uncle, the usurper Ptolemaic. Upon her father's death, Baroness II ascended the throne as the sole ruler of Egypt. A Ptolemaic queen ruled not as a regent or a co-ruler, but as a queen regnant in her own right. She was wildly popular with the people of Alexandria, who saw in her a chance for a fresh start, a break from the endless, dreary cycle of feuding brothers. Her popular, independent reign lasted for only 6 months. It was brought to a violent end by the looming shadow of Rome, the last toxic branch of the Ptolemaic family tree. The Roman dictator Sulla, now the arbiter of Eastern Mediterranean politics, had his own candidate for the Egyptian throne. This was the son of the deceased Ptolemy ex Alexander I, who had been raised in Rome and was thus seen as a reliable Roman client. Sulla dispatched this young man, who would become Ptolemy ex Alexander I, to Alexandria with a clear mandate. He was to marry his much older cousin, the reigning queen Baroness II, and become her co-ruler. The arrangement was a transparent Roman imposition, a political marriage designed to ensure their man had a legitimate claim to the throne. Baroness II, faced with the overwhelming power of Rome, had no choice but to accept. She married her young cousin and stepson. The marriage, and her life, lasted for only 19 days. Immediately after the wedding, Ptolemaic I, presumably fearing that his popular wife would overshadow him and perhaps even have him eliminated, had her murdered. The assassination of the people's polity, the Alexandrian mob, which had tolerated Roman meddling but would not stand for the murder of their queen, erupted in a fury. They stormed the royal palace, dragged the new king out into the streets, and tore him to pieces. The dynasty had reached a new low. A Roman-backed king, installed to create stability, had been lynched by his own subjects less than 3 weeks into his reign. The direct, legitimate lines of the Ptolemaic house were now all but extinguished, leaving a power vacuum that invited chaos and for an intervention on an unprecedented scale. The lynching of Ptolemy ex Alexander I in 80 BC was a visceral act of pure justice that left the Ptolemaic dynasty in a state of constitutional and genealogical crisis. Both legitimate male lines descending from Ptolemy, the Physcom, were now extinct. The elder line of Ptolemaic Lathyrus had ended with the death of Lathyrus himself, and the younger line of Ptolemy ex Alexander I had just been torn apart in the streets of Alexandria. The throne of the wealthiest kingdom in the Mediterranean was, for all practical purposes, vacant. This power vacuum created a scramble among the last remaining, and illegitimate, branches of the sprawling Ptolemaic family tree. The Alexandria NS, having just violently rejected a Roman-imposed king, took matters into their own hands. They proclaimed a new monarch from the available pool of royal descendants. Their choice was a young man who was an illegitimate son of Ptolemaic Lathyrus. He ascended the throne as Ptolemaic Dynasty. His connection to the main royal line was tenuous at best, but he was the son of the last popular king, and that was enough to secure the support of the capital. He followed the now minor standard dynastic practice and married his sister, in this case likely another illegitimate child of Lathius, a woman named Cleopatra Retelling. This new king would earn himself the derisive nickname Oletes, the flute player, a testament to his decadent, kingly obsession with participating in Dionysian festivals and his almost complete lack of interest in the actual business of governance. While Oletes was being installed in Alexandria, another illegitimate Ptolemy was making his own claim. His brother, also named Ptolemaic, overseas possession, the island of Cyprus. This effectively split the kingdom once again, with one illegitimate brother ruling in Egypt and another in Cyprus, a pale echo of the more consequential fraternal rivalries of the previous century. The central and overwhelming political reality of this era was the lengthening shadow of the Roman Republic. Rome was no longer a distant arbiter to be occasionally consulted. It was now the undisputed superpower of the Mediterranean, its internal politics directly shaping the fates of client kingdoms like Egypt. In the last will of the murdered Ptolemaic Dynasty, a document that may have been a Roman forgery, the kingdom of Egypt was supposedly bequeathed to the Roman people. This will become a terrifying political weapon. Ambitious Roman senators and populists in the forum could, at any time, propose the formal annexation of Egypt, citing the will as legal justification. For primary goal of his reign was not to govern his kingdom, but to prevent this from happening. His entire foreign policy was a desperate and humiliating exercise in bribery and lobbying. Oletes spent unimaginable sums of money, plunging the kingdom into catastrophic debt, to secure official Roman recognition of his kingship. He funneled vast fortunes into the pockets of powerful Roman figures like Pompey the Great and Julius Caesar, paying them to act as his patrons and protect his interests in the Senate. This reached a new low in 58 BCE. A tribune in Rome, Publius Clodius Pulcher, an ally of Caesar, passed a law formally annexing the island of Cyprus. The justification was flimsy, based on the supposed misrule of Ptolemy of Cyprus. Rome dispatched Marcus Borsius Cato the Younger, to oversee the annexation. The king of Cyprus, seeing the hopelessness of his situation, chose to commit suicide rather than suffer the humiliation of being deposed. In Alexandria, his brother, Ptolemaic Dynasty, did nothing. He offered no protest, no military aid, no diplomatic intervention to save his brother or his kingdom's territory. He silently acquiesced to the Roman seizure of Cyprus to ensure that Rome did not also annex Egypt. This craven inaction earned him the hatred and contempt of his own subjects. The Alexandria NS, proud and nationalistic, were disgusted by a king who would sell off parts of his kingdom and sacrifice his own brother to save himself. A massive popular uprising drove the flute player from his throne. He fled, predictably, to Rome, to plead with his patrons to restore him. In his absence, the Alexandria NS placed his wife, Cleopatra Retelling, and his eldest daughter, the formidable Baroness IB, on the throne. When Cleopatra died a year later, Baroness died a year later, a popular and defiant queen who symbolized a return to Egyptian independence. She even attempted to secure her rule by marrying a Seleucid prince, a brief and ill-fated attempt to revive the old Hellenistic alliances. Ptolemaic Oletes, meanwhile, was in Rome mortgaging the future of his kingdom to secure his restoration. He took out massive new loans from Roman bankers to bribe every influential senator he could. Finally, in 55 BC, with the backing of Pompey and funded by the banker Roberius Postumus, the Roman governor of Syria, Aulus Gabinius, was paid an astronomical sum of 10,000 talents to invade Egypt with his legions. The Roman army marched on Alexandria, crushed the Egyptian forces, and restored the deeply unpopular Ptolemaic Dynasty to his throne. His first act upon his return was to execute his own daughter, the ruling queen Baroness IV. The flute player was king again, but he was no longer a king in any meaningful sense. He was a Roman puppet, his throne propped up by Roman swords, his treasury looted by Roman creditors. He had saved his crown, but he had lost his kingdom. Egypt was now, in all but name, a province of Rome, and its fate would be decided not in Alexandria, but in the bloody civil wars that were about to consume the Republic itself. The restoration of Ptolemaic Dynasty by Roman legions in 55 BCE marked the final, humiliating phase of his reign. He returned to Alexandrian hero, but as a debt-ridden client, his authority entirely dependent on the Roman garrison left behind by the general Gabinius to protect him from his own people. These Roman soldiers, known as the Gabiniani, quickly became a law unto themselves in the capital, a permanent and arrogant reminder of Egypt's subjugation. The king himself was a broken man, his remaining years dedicated to the grim and impossible task of repaying the colossal bribes and loans he had secured from his Roman patrons. To service this debt, he imposed crushing taxes on his subjects, further immiserating the population and cementing their hatred for him. The flute player's reign, which had begun in a constitutional crisis, was ending in a state of national bankruptcy and foreign occupation. During this period of decay, the king's primary focus was on securing the succession for his surviving children. He had several, but would play a role in the dynasty's final act. Two daughters, the famous Cleopatra and a younger girl named Arsinoe, and two sons, both named Ptolemy. The eldest of these, and by far the most intelligent and ambitious, was Cleopatra. Born around 16 BC, she came of age in a court that was a masterclass in political survival, corruption, and the overwhelming influence of Roman power. She witnessed her father's exile, her sister Berenice Iversa's popular but doomed reign, and her father's bloody return on the backs of Roman legionaries. Unlike her indolent father, Cleopatra possessed the charisma, intellect, and ruthless pragmatism that had characterized the dynasty's founders. She was fluent in multiple languages, including, significantly, the native Egyptian tongue, a feat none of her Ptolemaic predecessors had bothered to achieve. She understood with a clarity that eluded her father that the key to Egypt's survival lay not in resisting Rome, but in skillfully manipulating its internal power struggles for her own benefit. In the spring of 51 BCE, Ptolemaic Dynasty led testament to his complete subservience to Rome. In it, he named his two eldest children, the 18-year-old Cleopatra V, and her 10-old brother, Ptolemaic III, as joint heirs. They were to rule together as husband and wife, following the long-established incestuous tradition of the dynasty. Crucially, the will named the Roman Republic as the official executor of its terms, a final, posthumous appeal for Rome to protect his children and, by extension, Egypt's nominal independence. A copy of the will was sent to be stored in the Roman treasury, formally placing the Ptolemaic succession under the legal guardianship of the Senate. The joint reign of the teenage sister and the child brother began, as so many had before, in a climate of intense court intrigue. From the outset, Cleopatra sought to dominate the partnership. Coins were initially issued with her image alone, and her name appeared first in official documents. She was the senior partner in fact as well as in age, a young woman of formidable will attempting to assert control over a government that had been hollowed out by her father's failures. However, she was not operating in a vacuum. A powerful clique of courtiers quickly formed around her younger brother, seeking to use him as a puppet to advance their own ambitions. This faction was led by three influential figures: the eunuch Pothinus, who was the chief minister of the kingdom, the Auditus of Chios, the young king's tutor, and Achiel, as the commander of the Egyptian army. This trio of advisors saw the ambitious young queen as the primary obstacle to their own power. They systematically worked to undermine her authority, stoking her young brother minus husband's resentment and building a base of support within the army and the Alexandrian government. They portrayed Cleopatra as an overbearing tyrant and championed the cause of the boy king, Ptolemaic III, as the true, more pliable, focus of national loyalty. The situation was a classic Ptolemaic power struggle, a monarch attempting to rule in their own right being challenged by a faction of courtiers who sought to control a younger, weaker co-ruler. The conflict escalated rapidly. A series of bad Nile floods led to famine and economic unrest, further destabilizing the political situation. By 48 BCE, the court faction had made their move. Citing her supposed tyranny, Pothinus and his allies formally deposed Cleopatra. They declared her brother, the 13-year-old Ptolemaic Dynasty, the sole ruler of Egypt. Just like her father before her, was forced to flee Alexandria to save her life. She escaped to the eastern frontiers of Egypt, where she immediately began to gather a mercenary army. She was her father's daughter in this respect too. Deposed and exiled, she was determined to fight her way back to the throne. The final Ptolemaic civil war had begun. A teenage sister and her child brother, manipulated by their ambitious ministers, were now poised to tear the last remnants of the kingdom apart. But this time, the outcome would not be decided by Egyptian armies, but by the arrival on their shores of the most powerful man in the world. The civil war between Cleopatra II and her brother Ptolemaic was, in its initial stages, a characteristically Ptolemaic affair. Two royal siblings, supported by rival factions, were mobilizing armies to contest the throne. Cleopatra, displaying a strategic acumen far beyond her 20-1 years, had assembled a respectable mercenary force in Syria and was preparing to invade Egypt from the east. Her brother's army, commanded by the general Achilles, marched to the fortress of Pelis to block her advance. The two Ptolemaic armies faced each other across the desert frontier, poised for a battle that would decide the fate of the kingdom. It was at this precise moment, in the late summer of 48 BC, that the much larger and more consequential civil war consuming the Roman Republic crashed directly into their own. News Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, once the most powerful man in Rome and the primary patron of the late Ptolemaics, Ioletes, appeared off the coast near Pelis. His fleet was small, his army shattered. He was a fugitive, having just suffered a catastrophic defeat at the hands of his rival, Julius Caesar, at the Battle of Pharsalus in Greece. Seeking refuge and a chance to regroup, Pompey turned to the kingdom he had helped prop up, appealing to the children of his late client for aid. This unexpected arrival presented the court of the boy king, Ptolemaic III, with a momentous and perilous decision. The regents Pothinus, Theodotus, and Achilles convened a council to determine their response. Their deliberation was a cold calculus of power. To grant Pompey sanctuary would be to incur the wrath of the victorious Caesar, who was in hot pursuit. To deny him would be to spurn a powerful Roman with deep connections to their kingdom, who might yet rally his forces. Theodotus of Chios, the king's tutor, is said to have offered the grim, pragmatic advice that has echoed through history. A dead man cannot bite. They chose a third, treacherous option. They would not simply deny Pompey refuge. They would murder him, believing that this gruesome gift would earn them the favor of the approaching Caesar. They sent a small boat to Pompey's flagship, welcoming him ashore. As the great Roman general stepped onto Egyptian soil, he was stabbed to death by one of his own former officers, now in the service of the Ptolemaic king. His head and signet ring were taken as proof of the deed. It was an act of profound treachery, a miscalculation of catastrophic proportions. A few days later, Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria. He came with only a small force, about 4,000 legionaries, expecting to accept the surrender of his defeated rival. Instead, he was presented with Pompey's severed head. Caesar's reaction was not one of gratitude, but of fury and disgust. Pompey had been his rival, his enemy, and his former son in law. But he was also a Roman consul, a towering figure of the Republic. For him to be murdered in such a cowardly fashion by a client king was an unforgivable insult to the majesty of Rome. Caesar, a master of political theatre, is said to have wept at the sight. He immediately took up residence in the royal palace, making it clear that he, as the representative of the Roman Republic and the executor of Ptolemaic I's will, would now adjudicate the dispute between the warring Egyptian siblings. This Roman intervention utterly transformed the situation. Caesar summoned both Ptolemaic I and Cleopatra to Alexandria to plead their cases before him. For Cleopatra, exiled and outnumbered, this was the opportunity she desperately needed. Unable to enter the city, which was controlled by her brother's forces, she arranged to be smuggled past the enemy lines. The historian Plutarch famously recounts that she was rolled up inside a carpet or bed sack and carried into the palace as a gift for the Roman general. That night, the brilliant, charismatic 20-1-year-old queen and the 50-old, battle-hardened Roman dictator became lovers. This was not simply an act of passion, it was a political merger of the highest order. Cleopatra secured the personal and political backing of the most powerful man in the world, while Caesar gained a loyal and highly capable ally in Egypt, along with potential access to the kingdom's legendary wealth to pay his troops. The next morning, when Caesar presented the reconciled siblings to the court, the faction of Ptolemaic realized they had been completely outmaneuvered. Pothinus the eunuch, seeing his influence and his life in peril, incited the Alexandrian mob and ordered the general Achilles to march his 20,000-strong army on the capital. The small Roman force found itself besieged in the palace district by a full-scale army and a hostile population. The Alexandrian War had begun. The conflict raged for months, a brutal urban war fought through the streets and harbors of the great city. During the fighting, parts of the city were burned, and the great library may have suffered significant damage. Caesar, in a desperate struggle for his own survival, had Pothinus executed. The young king, Ptolemaic III, sensing the tide turning against the Romans, escaped the palace to join the Egyptian army, becoming the figurehead of the resistance. The war culminated in the Battle of the Nile in early 47 BC. Roman reinforcements arrived, and in the ensuing battle, the Egyptian army was crushed. The boat carrying the fleeing Ptolemaics capsized in the river, and the boy king, weighed down by his golden armor, drowned. His body was later identified in the mud. The civil war was over. The brother was dead, and the sister, backed by Roman swords, was the undisputed ruler of Egypt. The drowning of Ptolemaic III in the Nile in early 47 BC brought the Alexandrian War to a decisive end. Julius Caesar was now the undisputed master of Egypt. He had arrived as an arbiter and, through a brutal 9-month siege, had become its conqueror. With Cleopatra's primary rival eliminated, Caesar could now formally settle the affairs of the kingdom in a way that served, despite Egypt's effective conquest. Outright annexation was not a politically viable option for him. It would have been seen as a naked power grab in Rome and would have entangled him in the complexities of administering a vast and frequently rebellious kingdom. A far more elegant solution was to maintain Egypt's status as a client kingdom, but with a ruler whose loyalty was absolute and personal. That ruler, of course, was Cleopatra. However, the deeply ingrained traditions of the Ptolemaic court, and indeed the terms of her own father's will, required a male co-ruler. A queen could not, by custom, rule alone. To satisfy this convention and create a stable, Roman-approved government, Caesar reached for the last available male heir of the Ptolemaic line. This was Cleopatra's youngest brother, a boy of about 12 or 13, also named Ptolemy. In a ceremony presided over by the victorious Roman general, the young boy was proclaimed King Ptolemaic IV. Immediately following his coronation, he was married to his triumphant elder sister, Cleopatra VII. This marriage was a complete political fiction. It was a union between a formidable, politically astute woman in her early 20s who had just won a civil war, and a powerless adolescent boy who was her brother in name and now her husband in title. Unlike previous sibling marriages that were fraught with genuine rivalry, this one was a formality from its inception. Ptolemaic IV was not a partner, a rival, or even a co-ruler in any meaningful sense. A living placeholder required to legitimize his sister's reign in the eyes of her subjects. He held the titles of king and pharaoh, but he possessed no actual authority. All power resided with Cleopatra, and by extension, with her Roman patron Caesar. Following the settlement of the Egyptian throne, Caesar did not immediately depart. He and Cleopatra embarked on a famous 2-month tour of the Nile, a lavish and leisurely procession upriver on the Queen's magnificent state barge. This was both a victory lap and a political statement. It allowed Cleopatra to display her power and her connection to the victorious Roman general to the people of the Egyptian countryside, solidifying her authority throughout the kingdom. It was during this period that Clea pregnant with Caesar's child. In June of 47 BCE, after Caesar had departed to deal with other threats to his power, she gave birth to a son. She named him Ptolemy Caesar and promoted him with the epithet Caesarion, Little Caesar. For Cleopatra, this child was the ultimate dynastic achievement. He was not just the heir to the throne of Egypt, he was the son of the most powerful man in Rome, a living symbol of the union of the ancient lineage of the Ptolemies and the future of Roman power. In 46 BCE, Cleopatra, along with her puppet-minus husband Ptolemaic IV and her infant son Caesarion, traveled to Rome at Caesar's invitation. She was housed in one of Caesar's lavish villas outside the city in Queen. Her presence caused a considerable scandal in the conservative Roman society, but it was also a clear demonstration of her special status. Caesar even had a golden statue of her placed in the Temple of Venus Genetrix, an unprecedented honor. During this time, Ptolemaic IV was a complete non-minus entity, a silent, adolescent appendage to his sister's diplomatic mission. He was the husband who was not a husband, the king who was not a king. The political situation changed dramatically on the Ides of March, 44 BCE, with the assassination of Julius Caesar. His death sent shockwaves through the Roman world and placed Cleopatra in a position of extreme peril. Her great protector was gone. The political faction that had murdered him was now in control of Rome. Recognizing her vulnerability, Cleopatra and her entourage unquietly left the city and returned to Egypt. The 16-year-old Ptolemaic IV died. The ancient historian Josephus states plainly that he was poisoned by his sister. While definitive proof is lacking, the timing is deeply suspicious and the motive is clear. With Caesar gone, Cleopatra could not afford any potential source of internal division. A teenage brother who might one day be used as a pawn by a rival Roman faction or an internal court conspiracy was a liability she could no longer tolerate. His quiet and convenient death removed the last male co-minus ruler required by tradition, clearing the way for her to elevate her own son, Caesarion, to the status of co-minus ruler, solidifying her own power in a newly uncertain world. The last brother was now gone, another victim of the dynasty's lethal, 0-some game of power. The assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BC and the subsequent death of Ptolemaic IV plunged Cleopatra's carefully constructed world into chaos. Her political and personal alliance with Caesar was the bedrock of her power. Without him, she was no longer the favored partner of Rome's undisputed master, but simply another client monarch in a Roman world now consumed by a new and vicious civil war. The primary factions in this conflict were the liberators, led by Caesar's assassins, Brutus and Cassius, who had taken control of the eastern provinces, and the Caesarianists, led by Caesar's loyal general Mark Antony and his young, shrewd great-nephew and heir Octavian. For the first few years after Caesar's death, Cleopatra played a cautious and pragmatic game. Egypt was still immensely wealthy, particularly in grain, a strategic resource vital for feeding armies. Both factions demanded her support, but she skillfully temporized, offering nominal assistance while preserving her kingdom's neutrality and resources as much as possible. Her strategic position was complicated by the presence of her younger sister, Arsinoe IV. Arsinoe had been a thorn in Cleopatra's side since the Alexandrian War. She had escaped from Caesar's custody, joined the Egyptian army, and had been proclaimed queen by the forces fighting against Caesar and Cleopatra. After the Roman victory, she was captured and taken to Rome, where she was famously paraded in Caesar's triumph. Unlike other captured enemy leaders, her life was spared, and she was sent to live in exile in the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, a major city in Roman-controlled Asia Minor. While in exile, she remained a potent symbol of opposition to Cleopatra, a potential alternative Ptolemaic queen who could be used by any Roman faction seeking to destabilize Egypt. For Cleopatra, who had just eliminated her last brother, her exiled sister was the final, lingering familial threat. The decisive turning point came in 42 BCE at the Battle of Philippi, where the forces of Antony and Octavian crushed the armies of Brutus and Cassius. With the liberators defeated, the Caesarian faction was now the master of the Roman world. They divided the Republic's territories between them, with Octavian taking control of the west and Mark Antony assuming command of the rich eastern provinces, including Egypt's sphere of influence. Began a tour of his new domain, summoning client rulers to account for their actions during the civil war. In 41 BCE, he sent for Queen Cleopatra. He summoned her to meet him in the city of Tarsus in Cilicia. Cleopatra's response to this summons was a masterpiece of political theater and personal diplomacy. She understood that this was not a meeting between a Roman general and a subordinate client. It was an audition, a negotiation for a new partnership. Instead of arriving as a supplicant, she staged an entrance of breathtaking opulence, designed to captivate the Roman general, who was known for his love of luxury and grand gestures. According to Plutarch, she sailed up the river Cydnus to Tarsus in a magnificent barge with a golden stern, purple sails, and silver oars. She was dressed as the goddess Venus, the Roman equivalent of the Greek Aphrodite, attended by handmaidens disguised as nymphs and graces. The scent of incense wafted from the ship to the shore, and the entire city turned out to witness the spectacle. Antony, who fancied himself a modern -day Dionysus, was enchanted. He had summoned her to his tribunal, but she had instead summoned him to her feast. The meeting in Tarsus was an overwhelming success. Antony, a charismatic and battle-hardened soldier but a far less astute politician than Caesar, was completely captivated by Cleopatra's intelligence, wit, and charm. They became lovers, forging a personal and political alliance that would shape the fate of the Mediterranean for the next decade. For Cleopatra, this new partnership was the key to her survival and the restoration of her kingdom's power. She had once again aligned herself with the most powerful Roman in her part of the world. Her first request of her new lover was a demonstration of his commitment and the final resolution to her dynastic security concerns. She asked for the death of her sister Arsinoe. Antony, eager to please his new ally, consented. He dispatched assassins to the temple of Artemis in Ephesus. Arsinoe IV was dragged from the sanctuary of the temple, a sacrilegious act that shocked the Greek world, and was executed on the temple steps. With this final, brutal act of fratricide outsourced to a Roman general, Cleopatra had eliminated the last of her siblings. The Game of Thrones that had begun with her father's will was over. She was now the sole, undisputed heir of the Ptolemaic line, her position secured not by family loyalty, but by the systematic elimination of every one of her brothers and sisters. The alliance forged between Cleopatra and Mark Antony in Tarsus was far more than a mere love affair. It was a strategic partnership with immense geopolitical implications. For the next decade, from 41 to 31 BC, their fates were inextricably linked. Antony spent the winter of 41-40 BCE in Alexandria, a period of legendary indulgence and revelry, but also one of serious political planning. Together, he and Cleopatra envisioned a new order for the Eastern Mediterranean, a Romano-Egyptian empire with Alexandria as its capital, a grand Hellenistic monarchy that would rival the power of Octavian in the West. For Cleopatra, this was the culmination of her life's ambition, not just to preserve Egypt, but to restore the Ptolemaic Empire to its former glory, using Roman military might as her instrument. This partnership bore both personal and political fruit. Cleopatra gave birth to twins, a boy named Alexander Helios the sun, and a girl named Cleopatra Selene the moon. A few years later, she would have a third child with Antony, another son named Ptolemy Philadelphus. These children were not merely the product of a romance, they were the heirs to the new Eastern Empire they planned to build. Antony, for his part, became increasingly detached from Roman political life, going native in the eyes of his critics in Rome. He adopted the lifestyle of a Hellenistic king, participating in the luxurious court life of Alexandria and openly presenting himself as Cleopatra's consort. The political culmination of their joint ambition came in the autumn of 34 BC, with the ceremony known as the Donations of Alexandria. It was a piece of grand political theater, staged in the city's gymnasium after a successful military campaign by Antony in Armenia. Antony and Cleopatra sat on golden thrones, elevated on a silver platform, dressed as the gods Dionysus and Isis. Their children were seated on smaller thrones below them. Antony made a series of stunning proclamations. He declared Cleopatra Queen of Kings and her son Caesarion, the child she had by Julius Caesar, the King of Kings. He affirmed Caesarion as Caesar's true son and legal heir, a direct challenge to the legitimacy of Octavian, who derived his power from his status as Caesar's adopted son. Antony then proceeded to distribute the kingdoms and territories of the east among Cleopatra's other children. Alexander Helios was named king of Armenia, Media, and Parthia, the last of which was not even under Roman control. His twin sister, Cleopatra Selene, was made queen of Cyrenaica and Libya, and the infant Ptolemy Philadelphus was proclaimed king of Phoenicia, Syria, and Cilicia. These declarations were a radical redrawing of the map of the Roman East. Antony was unilaterally creating new Hellenistic kingdoms, ruled by Cleopatra's children, with Cleopatra herself as the supreme overlord, all under his military protection. For Cleopatra, it was the realization of a dynastic dream, the creation of a Ptolemaic sphere of influence far larger than anything her ancestors had possessed since the 3rd century BCE. In Rome, these actions were a propaganda, a gift for Octavian. Antony's rival had been waging a relentless campaign of character assassination against him for years, and the donations of Alexandria provided the perfect ammunition. Octavian portrayed Antony as a decadent, drunken fool who had abandoned his Roman heritage, a man bewitched by a foreign sorceries, a traitor who was giving away Roman territories to his illegitimate, half-minus Egyptian children. He painted Cleopatra as a monstrous, power-hungry foreign queen who sought to conquer Rome itself and move the capital to Alexandria. The narrative was skillfully crafted to play on Roman xenophobia, misogyny, and fear of monarchical rule. The final break came in the 2 BC. Antony formally divorced his Roman wife, Octavia, who was Octavian's own sister. This was seen as a grave insult and the final proof that he had turned his back on Rome. In response, Octavian illegally seized Antony's will from the Temple of the Vestal Virgins and read it aloud to the Senate. The will reportedly confirmed his desire to be buried in Alexandria alongside Cleopatra and acknowledged his children by her, further inflaming public opinion. Capitalizing on this outrage, Octavian had the Senate declare war. Crucially, war was not declared on Antony, which would have risked being seen as another Roman civil war. Instead, it was declared on Queen Cleopatra. This framed the conflict not as an internal Roman power struggle, but as a patriotic war to defend Rome against a foreign enemy. The final gamble had been made. The personal and political destinies of Antony and Cleopatra were now tied to the outcome of a single, decisive military confrontation that would determine not just their own fates, but the future of Rome and the 300-year-old dynasty of the Ptolemies. The final war was not a protracted campaign but a single, cataclysmic event. On September 2nd, 31 BC, the vast fleets of Antony and Cleopatra met the smaller, more agile fleet of Octavian, commanded by his brilliant general Marcus Agrippa, at the Battle of Actium off the western coast of Greece. The engagement was the largest naval battle of the Roman era. For hours, the heavy, powerful warships of Antony's fleet battled Agrippa's lighter vessels. Then, for reasons that remain a subject of intense historical debate, Cleopatra's squadron of 60 ships, held in reserve, suddenly hoisted sail and broke through the center of the fighting, fleeing the battle and heading south towards Egypt. Antony, seeing her depart, abandoned his command, boarded a smaller her. Whether this was a planned tactical withdrawal or a catastrophic failure of nerve, the effect was the same. The morale of Antony's fleet shattered. His abandoned forces, fighting without their commander, were systematically outmaneuvered and destroyed or forced to surrender. The land army he had stationed nearby, witnessing the disaster at sea, defected to Octavian a week later. The war was lost in a single afternoon. The return to Alexandria was not a retreat but a rout. Antony and Cleopatra were now isolated, their vast military power evaporated. They spent a final, grim year in the capital, their alliance and their lives disintegrating under the pressure of their inevitable doom. Antony fell into a deep depression, punctuated heavy drinking. Cleopatra began methodically testing various poisons on condemned prisoners, seeking a quick and painless means of death. They were monarchs of a kingdom that was already in effect a ghost. In the summer of 30 BCE, Octavian began his final, methodical invasion. He advanced on Egypt with 2 armies, one from the west out of Cyrene and the main force, which he commanded personally, from the east way to the Nile, fell with little resistance, its commander likely having been bribed. Antony managed to rally his remaining troops for one last, desperate engagement outside Alexandria, winning a minor cavalry skirmish that temporarily lifted his spirits. It was a false dawn. The next day, as he prepared for a major battle, his entire remaining fleetened cavalry deserted to Octavian. He was left with nothing. At that moment, a false report, perhaps circulated by Cleopatra herself to manipulate events, reached him that the queen had committed suicide. Believing everything was lost, Antony fell upon his sword. The wound was mortal but not immediately fatal. As he lay dying, he learned that Cleopatra was still alive, having barricaded herself with her most trusted attendants and her treasure in her mausoleum, a grand tomb she had built near the temple of Isis. His loyal guards carried the dying Antony to the foot of the mausoleum. Unable to open the heavy doors, Cleopatra and her women lowered ropes and hoisted him up through a high window. He died in her arms, a tragic Hellenistic end for a man who had squandered a real empire for the dream of one. Octavian's soldiers meanwhile stormed the city and, using a ladder to access the same high window, managed to enter the mausoleum and take Cleopatra captive. Her capture was a supreme political prize for Octavian. His primary goal was to parade her through the streets of Rome in his triumph, a living symbol of his victory and the conquest of the East. In their final meeting, the cold, pragmatic Roman politician and the last Ptolemaic queen faced each other. Cleopatra, a proud monarch to the end, attempted to negotiate, pleading for her kingdom to be passed to her children. Octavian was unmoved, offering only vague assurances while making it clear her fate was to be the star attraction in his victory parade. For Cleopatra, a woman who had ruled as a living goddess, this public humiliation was a fate worse than death. A few days later, on August 12, 30 BC, she made her final move. After bathing and dressing in her finest royal regalia, she was found dead on her golden couch, one of her handmaidens dead at her feet and another dying as she adjusted the queen's diadem. The means of her death were but the story that she had an asp, the sacred serpent of the pharaohs, smuggled to her in a basket of figs, became legendary. Octavian, though denied his ultimate prize, moved swiftly to consolidate his conquest. He ordered the immediate execution of Caesar Ion, Cleopatra's 17-year-old son by Julius Caesar. As a direct and biological heir of the deified Caesar, the boy was an existential threat to Octavian's own legitimacy. According to Plutarch, when advised on the matter, Octavian quoted a line from Homer: "It is not good to have too many Caesars." Cleopatra's other 3 children by Antony were paired and sent to Rome to be raised by Antony's spurned wife, Octavia. With the death of the last queen and the murder of the last king, the Ptolemaic dynasty was extinguished. After 3 centuries of brilliant, bloody, and self-consuming rule, the kingdom of Egypt was no more. The kingdom of Egypt was no more. It was now a Roman province, the personal property of the man who would soon be known as the Emperor Augustus. And so the curtain fell, not with a bang, but with the quiet hiss of a serpent. The great library, the lighthouse, the unimaginable wealth, the divine pretensions, all were finally consumed by the internal pathologies that had been cultivated for 300 years. The story of the Ptolemies is a clinical study in the corrosive nature of absolute power when sealed within the confines of a single family. The incestuous marriages were not the cause of the decay, but a symptom of it, a symptom of a profound isolation, a belief that their blood was so divine it could not be mixed with that of mortals. This belief created a closed system, a political and genetic echo chamber where paranoia, ambition, and cruelty could concentrate and magnify with each successive generation. The names repeated: Ptolemy, Cleopatra, Arsinoe, Berenice, as if the dynasty were wrapped in a recurring nightmare, each new incarnation doomed to replay the betrayals of the last. They were not monsters born of myth, but human beings placed within a system that rewarded ruthlessness and punished trust. They were scholars and patrons, but also murderers of their own children. They were diplomats of genius and tyrants of breathtaking cruelty. They built temples to the gods while behaving like demons to their own kin. And so we leave them to their fate. It makes one ask how thin, really, is the line between the civilization that built the Library of Alexandria and the savagery we just witnessed. The article is concluded.